Good evening to everyone, and we are here with the fifth episode of Indus Think. This is Abhivadan, and I have, as I stated, a cosmic panel for a cosmic discussion tonight. So we have Akshay, Krishnan, our dear Ruchir, Alexei, and our dear Karthikeya. So today we are going to discuss about a quite interesting and common topic, but with a different context altogether, in the sense that generally it is discussed with partisan politics, but at a larger level, it is not. It is more about serious issues of diplomacy and governance, which most. So, we are going to discuss, as the title says, bureaucracy, neutrality, and Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. Now, I don't need to explain the audience about Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam in general. It's a concept out of the Indian literature, which is about a conceived notion. Again, I'm not claiming anything. A conceived notion that we have to include everybody as a part of a family, as people try to translate it. But and the idea of neutrality also in Indian diplomacy relates to that. So the crux of this discussion uh, should be, again, it depends on how the speakers want to go ahead with it. But the idea behind this discussion was very clear that since the idea of neutrality has been a very important part of Indian diplomacy for long, maybe since the independence and so forth, we see in the non-aligned movement in the United Nations and other bodies, how actually has that shaped, especially from starting from the Cold War era, and in the practical terms, how is it affecting us? But there's one more underlying problem which actually is connected with these two things, which is our bureaucracy, especially the people in the diplomatic part of it, the MEA and the IAS and all those kind people. So they are also important stakeholders in Indian democracy, anyways. And sometimes we do not understand what neutrality is. For constitutional courts, it is another form in law. For diplomats and for the public also, it's a very different thing altogether. Maybe it could be concerned with partisan politics or not. So let's start a discussion right away. And since I have given a briefing of it, I would not waste much time, and I'll just pass the baton to the speakers directly. So I'd like to ask Krishnan to basically give his insights about the idea of neutrality. And he can take the insights even in the domain of hard power, because, of course, neutrality has much origins from there. So, Krishnan, the floor is yours. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Abhi, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to kind of appear. I'm not, I'm not, I do not really claim to be an expert, but I'm just here to just say what I think of it. Neutrality, yeah. So neutrality, we all know from a geopolitics perspective, we've had it in multiple senses. Like you, during the just after the Cold War, when India attained independence, yeah, we started with the non-alignment. The Bandung Conference happened, and then throughout Cold War, we tried to kind of like. Uh, I believe like the neutrality in its original sense started with the idea that we would not be joining the both the blocks of Cold War, and then like within I think within few years we saw like that's not always possible, and not just for India but whoever joined the non-alignment movement, each of those countries, like the big countries, they all had the issues of their own. Like they all had their interests of their own that kind of was being in some way or the other being chewed upon by either sides, either blocks, and it did not make eminent sense for the either the post-colonial in new democracies or like new countries like India, or for that matter other countries, to kind of be neutral, because the first what we forgot in terms of conception is that we assumed that the material prosperity for India and the national defense and sovereignty would be automatically taken care of. Like Nehru was a person who thought that India didn't require an army itself, and it couldn't have been more wrong, right? Uh, And then we quickly began to realize this non-alignment thing will not exactly work as we imagined it to be. But then for some reason we did continue upon, because it's like sunk cost, right? Like we've invested so much in it, and we wanted to make it relevant, we want to keep the engine going, right? Then it came down to the 80s. It morphed into what we call as the strategic autonomy in the 2000s. Again, it didn't make much sense. We thought that we could afford to be neutral between either the USA or some of the emerging powers without taking sides. It had we did not do like a. I mean, when you take a multivariant problem like this, you also have to choose between what you optimize for, right? Like, do you optimize for to maximize the interest of your own nation, or do you maximize for what do you call like world peace and whatever intangible concept that we can think of? And when you start optimizing for each of these variables, the priorities will turn out to be different, right? And it is really unfortunate that we did not choose for maximizing our own self-interest for the sake of being all this kind of trying to bring a peaceful order, or trying to strengthen the liberal world order, something like that. So I think it is pretty recently that we are realizing that this neutrality is definitely not working. Although I'm not fully convinced that this establishment has completely come out of it. Uh, Famously, Dr. Jaishankar last year, I think it was in Brazil, during the G20 summit, that he said that we can afford to both have the J meeting as well as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting, as well as the BRICS meeting and the Quad meeting. Some would say that's India is playing all sides in this time of flux. But I think we are also kind of confused as to which side we want to join. I mean, it's not just about try. I think we are being passively deterministic rather than actively deterministic. I'll stop there.
Great. So let's have more insights about it, since we actually are going to discuss India's passive determinism. So, Richard, you can give it insights, and then maybe we can proceed.
Sure. So, neutrality as a concept in modern times, I'd see it as taking three different forms. You have passive neutrality, active neutrality, proactive neutrality. Now, passive neutrality is classical neutrality, like Switzerland, like Belgium in the 1800s until the First World War, and like Austria after the Second World War. So, what was that? So, Switzerland from 1815 onwards, from the Congress of Vienna after the end of the Napoleonic Wars. Belgium, after it was created as a buffer state to prevent there being a border with France and the Netherlands, and Austria after World War II to block off access to NATO troops between West Germany and Italy, were all declared neutral by other powers in order to guarantee their sovereignty. So these countries became neutral in order to protect their own sovereignty, and there were other countries that guaranteed their independence. What did neutrality mean then? No alliances, no access to their territory for military transport of any country. And it was often backed up by military conscription. So every adult male in these countries was conscripted into the army, and the army was purely for self-defense. It didn't have any ambitions for operations outside its territory, for annexing territory, for operations abroad. So that's passive neutrality, which is defensive. It doesn't, give you a big voice on the stage, but you can leverage it as, the League of Nations, for example, was headquartered in Switzerland, or many UN offices were headquartered in Switzerland, but Switzerland only joined the UN in 2004, saying joining the UN is a violation of our neutrality. We can't do that. So it took them 189 years to even accept that neutrality is compatible with joining a multilateral diplomacy forum. Then you have active neutrality. Active neutrality is a more recent concept. So after the Second World War, so then you had countries like Finland, which was neutral. You had countries like Yugoslavia, which was non-aligned, one of the leading non-aligned powers. You had Cyprus, you had Malta, you had countries in the developing world, in the global south, who did not want to be pulled into either the Eastern or Western bloc, but wanted to, like Krishnan said, play both sides, enjoy good relations with all, and keep their fingers out of messy situations. So not get dragged into conflicts. So they didn't join NATO or the Warsaw Pact. They didn't join SEATO or CENTO or any of these encumbering alliances. So they that was strategic autonomy. And then you have proactive neutrality, of which there was only really one example, and that was Sweden. So Sweden, after the late 60s, under Prime Minister Olof Palme, said that he had a very different visualization of what neutrality means. And he famously said, neutrality does not condemn us to silence. In fact, it gives you a greater opportunity, a greater platform, a moral platform in which you can decide for yourself what your self-interests are and what is morally right or wrong based on your country's values. So Sweden, despite being neutral, was very open in condemning the US in the Vietnam War, or it was very open in condemning the coup d'etat against Allende by Pinochet in Chile in 1973, and was also quite happy to give diplomatic support to the African National Congress and to SWAPO in Namibia in their struggles for independence against apartheid. So this is something that many people don't realize. They think neutrality just means being like Switzerland, staying out of everything and hiding people's money. But there's many forms of neutrality. And in India, unfortunately, we didn't view neutrality as a means of safeguarding our sovereignty, nor as a platform for expressing our interests, and instead used it as a moral force. It's like the satyagraha of geopolitics, to allow us to punch above our weight. That you go to the UN and give a speech about Panchsheel, or give a speech about these values that you hold so dear, and ahimsa, non-violence, and pacifism. But that is something you can only do once you have your sovereignty safeguarded, once you have your national interest defined, and then you should use this messaging to further that. But if you just take the aesthetics of values without any power to back it up, then people can see that that's shallow, and then they don't buy into it. And that's an issue that after independence, we wanted all of the trappings of a great power, of an independent country, of a sovereign state, without building the fundamentals. You need a national identity, you need national interests, you need a national narrative, and then you can defend it. Otherwise, you're just defending abstract values, and you don't even have the tools to push them.
Quite interesting. So, Alexei, you can go with your thoughts. Yeah, you can go ahead.
Yeah, so I actually enjoyed a lot of what Ruchir said. I think it was very clear-cut definitions of a lot of the topics regarding neutrality, and I actually would agree with him on a lot of these issues. And I personally am, to make it clear, I follow a more of a Marxist sort of analysis. So I think when Ruchir mentioned his points about aesthetic, holding up aesthetics without having the power to actually hold up these aesthetics, I was reminded of how Nehru basically said, oh, we're going to take 5-year plans, we're going to do industrialization, socialism, and basically he could not achieve the industrial base or the power or the state capacity to implement it, but just had the aesthetics. And naturally, we faced an economic collapse after around 1991. So it just reminded me of a lot of sort of the discourse that goes around in Indian communist circles, where they're saying, oh, they praise China for their development, and then suddenly they're like, no, any policy that wants to emulate China's development is actually crony capitalism. We can't do this, blah, blah, blah. They think, just like Lenin, they can achieve socialism without going through capitalism. and that is wrong because socialism comes from the contradictions of capitalism. Similarly, in terms of neutrality and in terms of upholding our ideals, you do not get to uphold neutrality, you do not get to uphold your interests if you do not have the material means of backing them up. And in this case, I am reminded of Theodore Roosevelt. He was the American president who greatly expanded the American Navy and was, I think, probably the person who started the concept of an American empire. And his sort of philosophy was, we have a big stick. That was his main philosophy, that we have the military means of defending ourselves. We will not attack unless our interests are being provoked. Obviously taking from Monroe Doctrine of, you cannot interfere in our region, which was, Cuba at that time, which was a Spanish colony, and the Spaniards were oppressing the Cubans, and then Theodore Roosevelt decides that, we need to liberate the Cubans and so on. So I think in that sense, I think what we have to figure out for India's neutrality, and I think India should be a neutral power, unnecessarily involving ourselves in geopolitical contests that have no massive bearing on our economic or diplomatic success. I think it's a completely stupid idea, but we have to engage neutrality in a very systematic way. We can't just go and say, we are not going to support either side. We're just going to remain silent and we're going to keep our head low. No, I think one example for with what India is doing with Israel-Palestine, I think is a very, very fundamental concept of what is good neutrality. On one hand, we are investing in Palestinian businesses. We are expanding a sort of IT park in Ramallah and these places, the West Bank in Palestine, which is something all these, anti-imperialists really love, or Palestine and so on. At the same time, we are expanding our agricultural and technological cooperation with Israel, which I think this sort of balancing is something we can pursue with sort of a higher stage of geopolitics. For example, this was a small example of Israel-Palestine. We can, do something similar with regards to, for example, America and China. So I think those are my, opening thoughts.
Great. So, Karthika, you can give your insights and then.
Sure. So, I agree with a lot of what panelists said, and I'm sure I'm keep taking the example of Israel and Palestine. It reminded me of something, that this relationship, this balancing act, has always been quite a tightrope for Indian diplomatic corps and Indian foreign policy experts, and I think India has balanced it quite well. But as we see now, it is not actually translating into a neutrality anymore, because recently we saw that a Palestinian authority wrote a strong worded letter. They gave letters to many countries, but also to India, despite knowing that India is always involved in such kinds of balancing act. It's not important to highlight it, it's useless, but still they did anyway. And the allies of Palestinians, if we can speak like that, the international liberal journalists or the lobbies in Pakistan and Turkey, they always equate Kashmir with Palestine. So is it translating to a neutrality or a balancing act? Is it helping us in any way? That's important. And I know there is a lot of consideration, being in India, we have a lot of Muslim population, and it's a sensitive issue. And India has always taken the approach of a two-nation theory. And I understand that it's okay to have a balance, but we need to actually assess positively how is it helping us. Similarly, if we ally with the West or not, or ally with the US as far as Pacific region is concerned, it doesn't matter, because China is already seeing us as a Western lackey. They see us as a country which has no self-respect, and we are just working on American orders. And so they have made up their mind. So we have to assess whether our neutrality is actually translating into a neutrality. Now, India has always taken this principled approach after colonization, that certain nations need time to actually build their own state capacity without aligning and making their foreign policy in sync with their with the bloc they join. So and they have always maintained this principled approach, even since the beginning of WTO negotiations, India has already taken the side of least development countries and African countries, that there are certain things we need to protect. And even the recent TRIPS waiver was also basically India representing the third world countries, basically. And India has always done that. So I believe that this principal approach can be taken if we think properly, strategically, if we build our state capacity and occupy international organizations like China did. Because so these rule-based order which we have is based upon the geopolitical realities of post-World War II. It's not good, it's not equitable. But that's the only thing we have. We don't have the power to change it. We don't have the power to challenge it. And Chinese rule-based order will be much bad for us. So what we can do is occupy these places, build our lobbies, go there and actually try to apply these rules which we have equitably. And through that, we can actually uphold our principal approach, and in the meantime, build our state capacity. And then we can talk about, like there is this idealist principle which we have to take, and then there are national interests. So we need to balance it. And I think Rousseau said that man is born free, but he's in chains everywhere. I see Indian strategic thinking like that. We are chains. We are a significant power, but we are in no position to dictate our terms, and we are in chains by red tapeism, lack of vigor, and our balancing act. And if we assess Iran, where we need to balance Russia-China equation, Israel-Palestine, I don't see a lot of success happening there. So my last point will be to whether assess how our balancing has been till now and what we can do to not make enemies of people, of not taking not betraying our principal approach since the beginning, but also keep our national interest, prioritize our national interest.
Great. So Akshay can declutter it. Yeah, please go ahead.
Sure. I have a slightly, I won't say contrarian, but a different take on some of these issues. I think neutrality was very well defined by Ruchir. Now we have to understand that this neutrality is not a value, right? It is a strategy. And like any strategy, we have to evaluate it with a cost-benefit kind of like framing about whether it actually helps you pursue your national interests or not. And that answer, at least for India, I think depends a lot on which period or which context you're talking about, right? So if you think about it, India is a player, but we don't shape the playing field. Playing field is always shaped by great powers. And essentially, I mean, post-independence, we are in the third world order, I would say. The first one was the bipolar world order with the US and the USSR. Then we had the unipolar movement with the US. And now we are in a stage of flux where we seem to be in the post-unipolar world with China emerging as a potential second pole, right, in the world, right? So if you take these three time frames, I would say neutrality was the right approach for India in the first time frame in the Cold War. With the very limited resources that India had, I thought, and given the context, which is that we were not on the doorstep of either the US or the USSR, we weren't in a part of the world and we weren't in a neighborhood which was an area of intense contestation between both great powers in any case. So we weren't in Europe, we weren't in Northeast Asia, we weren't in Middle East, right? These were the most valuable parts of the world where you had the most intense conflict. We weren't in any of those places. Given that was the case, and given the particular way in which we define national interests, rightly or wrongly, during that time. So if you take even our economic model and so on, it didn't really entail us making long-term bets, really intertwining with anybody else, right? So for instance, if we had followed a very export-led growth strategy for years on end, that would have probably involved a far deeper integration with, let's say, US and Western Europe. Now, whether we should have or shouldn't have is a different issue. I'm just saying, given that whole context of how we define national interests and what we thought was appropriate to secure those national interests, neutrality made eminent sense in that context, right? And to be clear also, neutrality meant retaining flexibility to be able to cooperate with great powers when it did suit our interests, which we very well did. So if you see, there was actually deep US-India cooperation also in a range of areas, right? Whether it came to science and technology, green revolution, and after the China war, the way we collaborated with the US. Much later, of course, before 1971, it also involved a deeper integration with the USSR, right? So it meant we retain flexibility. So neutrality is valuable, when you're in a context where you're not in a place of direct contestation between great powers, where you've defined your interests in such a way that you don't have to make long-term bets with people, which was the case then, right? And then you retain the flexibility to be able to form so-called issue-based coalitions on particular areas of interest. That is what it gave us at that stage, right? Now, after the Cold War ended, it's kind of meaningless in any case globally for anyone to talk in terms of neutrality, because there is only a single pole. So everyone is defining how to maximize our national interest while working in a context where there is one great power which has shaped the world order in a way that it thinks suits its interests, right? So that's the context in which we were operating. And in that, again, I think India did a very good job. We built a deeper relationship with the US. We grew our economy. We benefited. We were the second largest beneficiary of global trade after China in terms of poverty alleviation and so on. So if you actually look at it, that period of Pax Americana, the whole Washington consensus and all that is a period that India was a beneficiary of, and which it played relatively well. Now we are again in a period of flux where we are going towards an emerging China, where China is very clearly emerging as one of the big powers of Asia, potentially already a great power, and a great power which may have an adversarial relationship also with the US. That's the most likely kind of context. So this is the playing field that we're in now. I don't think neutrality will be as tenable now as it was in Cold War 1.0, right? Because we are in the part of the world which is the most intense theater. One of the two great powers is our primary adversary from a security standpoint. We have a collision of interests, and I'm not only talking of the territorial dispute. Even if you say that the territorial dispute is done and dusted for whatever it's worth, even then, the fact of the matter is that any enhancement of Chinese relative power is a threat to us. It's a classic security dilemma, right? Anything that we do to secure our interests, anything that we do to get stronger from a defense standpoint is a threat to China, and vice versa. Where we define our interests in the Asia Pacific, in the Indo-Pacific, is areas where our interests will naturally collide, right? Given that is the case, neutrality becomes far tougher to pull off, and whether it is even desirable is something that we should question, right? Because you have a great power on your doorstep. To be able to counter that great power, you will need, of course, your own internal power, but also you will probably need to borrow power, which means alliances and so on. The only way that you can do that is if you make long-term commitments. So the flexibility that you retain by being neutral to be able to form issue-based coalitions, that kind of goes away if you want people to make resource commitments. Resource commitments are made only when you have long-term commitments in general and alignment of interests. So now I think we are in a particularly challenging time for Indian foreign policy with the rise of China. And that is where we need to really kind of revisit this whole question of neutrality and what that means.
That's great. So I now open the floor. And before anyone can begin, really, I'll just give a few insights to make up the background of another part of what we're discussing. So, of course, I mean, in the past discussions when I had which I had with Ruchir and Karthikeya, we were discussing about rogue states and client states. Now, one thing is that the problem with us is that neither we are clear with what we have to do with Quad, because again, the problem is that if we say that it's according to Russia and China, a kind of a US-led entity against China for an anti-China sentiment, as everybody claims, although it depends. We are still not clear with Quad and the Indo-Pacific concept at the outset right now because of the very simple reasons. And the second problem with us is that the non-aligned movement thing, which still exists as an international body, we still attend NAM. The Prime Minister went last year during the lockdown time, ironically. That also is not going fine, whether it is Iran, or whether it is Israel, or I don't know, whether it is Russia, to some extent. But again, I think there might be some opinions on this which might contradict with what I say or may not. I don't know. But again, I just put up some background. So I open the floor. Now we can start it anyhow. So whosoever wishes to start first can do so. And let's see how this proceeds. And then obviously, we will be discussing more pointers out of it. And we'll be focusing on the concept of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam also, because it needs to be debunked at a policy level. Most of the time, we don't do it. So let's continue this discussion, this portion of Cold War neutrality and Indian diplomacy, and then let's see how it proceeds. Yeah. So, okay. Yeah, Richard, please.
Yeah. So I think Karthikeya and Akshay raised a very good point about the future of neutrality as a country that shares a border with one of the new superpowers in a increasingly bipolar, not multipolar yet, world. And with that in mind, it is important to realize that we have certain fundamental disagreements with China, which are at a philosophical level, not even something that can be solved by sitting down and resolving border conflicts. Because in Beijing, the policy-making elite of the Chinese Communist Party believe that India is not a fully sovereign country and should not be treated as an equal power. One. Two, that we still operate based on British era colonial standards. So our military, our administration, and our borders were defined by someone else and not by us. And because in that absence, we haven't projected any of our power, they don't respect us. Three, they think that because of our semi-alignment with Western capital, or at least Western intellectual and political philosophies, they think that we're mentally colonized and thus do not have any narrative or power projection. And then finally, they are invested in the failure of Indian democracy for their own domestic audiences. It's very important for the CPC or CCP, however you want to call it, to hold up India as an example of why demands for political liberalization in China by the public are a foolish dream. Because they will say, India has had democracy for 70 years. Do you want to be like India? Do you want to be poor, unequal, chaotic? Because that is what the West wants from you. And this is why yesterday was the anniversary of a certain incident in 1989. After that incident, when people were calling for political reform, the party said there will be no political reform, there will be economic reform. The Chinese social contract of the Dengist era is that we will guarantee you material prosperity, and you will accept that these are the rights and duties of a citizen of the People's Republic. And as a result, it's very important for them to show that India is an inferior power, that India has an inferior model, and that is why there is such deep Chinese involvement in Indian politics. They have agreements with two political parties in India, in the Indian media and Indian academia, in order to massage people's minds, in order to manage Indian democracy. But that's the beauty of democracy, that every foreign power can come and help manage your internal politics to suit them. That's something that we don't acknowledge and we don't bring up. And like you said, Abhivardhan, in the Quad, we just feel happy. Oh, we've been included in the Quad. We're the big boys now, and the US and Japan and Australia have paid attention to us and they're involving us. It's not enough to just be happy at being involved. Have you seen the Quad's statements? There's no Indian interest reference there. Do they mention our border issues with Tibet? Do they mention the Tibetan government in exile in Dharamshala? Do they mention our protection agreement with Bhutan? Do they mention Arunachal Pradesh? Do they mention anything that, where our soldiers are dying at the border? No, it's just about naval agreements. And as a result, one worries that because we don't have strategic thinking institutionalized in our country, and we don't have a clear vision or identity or narrative, that we're just being dragged along. And when it comes to it, when push comes to shove, it's still Indian soldiers who are going to die at the border, with Tibet. And at that point, coming to defend India's sovereignty is not worth the blood of a single Western soldier. There's no American soldiers who are going to come and save us. What will they do? They'll say, oh, we're going to put sanctions on 5 members of the Communist Party of China. Great. Yeah, what a wonderful achievement for diplomacy. That has no impact.
Yeah, I just have I don't know whether it's a question or an observation to what Ruchir has made here. So Ruchi, you mentioned that with regards to Quad, we've kind of overestimated ourselves in terms of what the Quad can achieve, and we've kind of overestimate our own relevance within the Quad. My own observation is that we kind of I mean, when I say we, I mean the Indian government. That's I mean specifically South Bloc. I think they have a lot more clarity as to what Quad entails and what are the expectations out of the Quad. I don't think they have any unrealistic expectations out of the Quad, except maybe like I think we do expect some kind of overt communication or some kind of I don't know how to put it, like a political signal from time to time to kind of let the powers, let China and maybe a couple of others know that we do have these guys by our back. But in my opinion, I think the people who are in Delhi, the establishment kind of wavers between saying that yeah, Quad is for the larger Indo-Pacific. We are trying to achieve a rules-based order here. There is nothing. We are not expecting anything out of it, like a NATO Article 5 or something. But there is also, I don't know whether this is for political returns or for the domestic audience, but there is sometimes the propensity within the political leadership to kind of make Quad like the NATO, right? Like when India was announced as a major defense partner with no, I mean, I think that was celebrated all around. But I think people do understand within their minds that it does not mean much, because considering where we are in terms of our defense preparedness as well as our technology, and what the way America usually functions in terms of how it wants defense relationship to be. So in that sense, do you think that China really thinks that the people in Delhi are deluding themselves, or is it just that they think that uh, that the establishment is clear, but it's just they can get carried away by public opinion?
So it's no secret what the foreign policy establishment in Beijing thinks of us. They say very openly that this is what they think of India, and India doesn't have a mind of its own. They just kind of go along with whatever the larger Anglosphere believes. And the issue with the Quad right now, as you summarized it, is that it will be seen in Beijing as, oh, India is joining this bloc, as we always suspected, and they're provoking us, instead of what we would actually want from this, which is a deterrent force, that we should be signaling clearly that if there is another provocation on the border, then we now have enough diplomatic or geopolitical support to push back against that and push back successfully. Now, we haven't really deployed the Quad in that way yet. I think because we're still trying to balance things out, we're still trying to have good relations and repair relations with China. So they haven't pushed for any overt Chinese-oriented messaging in their Quad statements, or at least from the Indian perspective. Now, that's an issue that it's very difficult to negotiate, between India and China when they're just on two planes, that they're playing two different games, and India wants to be seen as an equal power to China, as an equal neighbor, and negotiates as such, but China doesn't, and it's almost impossible to reconcile those two visions. That almost everything we do fits into what they expected of us anyway. And without some sort of deterrent messaging, it doesn't actually guarantee further security for us. A better model might be if we really take the official definition of Indo-Pacific as being the area between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. That means the original South Asia, which means everything south of the border with Tibet and China, which means the Indian subcontinent plus Southeast Asia. If we deepen cooperation there, India has a very large navy compared to the others. We could bring them into a broader security umbrella. We could deepen our commercial and our military ties with countries such as Myanmar, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, with whom we also have cultural ties. That would be more skin in the game, because these are all countries that share the same region, share the same concerns about China. Vietnam as well. That just because China and Vietnam are both communists, they're two different brands of communists. They've had a war at their north border before in the 70s and 80s. Vietnam also ended Pol Pot's regime in Cambodia, which was propped up by both the Chinese and the US. So this is where we should really be looking. Look east and build relationships with those who actually have an interest in collective defense. But I see Akshay wants to say something.
Yeah, I do. I have a slightly different view of Quad, right? Which is, I actually think it's a very good thing. So let me first outline the overall context, though I fully agree with Ruchir on also deepening partnerships. I mean, I think we get too caught in the meta-level question of US or China, which I think is, to my mind, a non-question, because China is a major adversary, and that's not the major choice. The point is, how do we balance versus China? And US for me is a third level answer for that. I mean, there is internal balancing, which is the first level of answer, which is we have to build our own capability. And second, we have to do external balancing with, to use a now discredited term, the coalition of the willing, right? The people who want to join with you, which to my mind, I think I fully agree with Ruchir, includes people like Vietnam, who have skin in the game, who have literally the same concerns that India has with a rising China, right? Because again, they have the same kinds of issues. And only thirdly, I would say, then there is also the US. But I don't think we should discount the US either. Let's face it, the largest power in the Indo-Pacific today is still the United States of America, right? In terms of sheer capability to project power and aggregate capacity that they have deployed here, the United States is still the largest power here. So it will end up being, and given the fact that the US will want to be the only superpower in the world still. China is a great power, not yet a superpower. Since the US will want to maintain its status as the only superpower, I think there is a huge alignment of interest between the India and the US. So in that sense, what classic strategy should tell us, which is that you're faced with an adversary who has far greater power, which means you have to build your own power and you have to borrow power by allying with other people. And who do you ally with, or who do you partner with? Those who have the power to spare, to deploy, and those who have the interest, a commonality of interest with you, to be to hence deploy that power in a way that benefits you as well. Given that that's the case, however, I fully agree with what Krishnan said. Quad or any such arrangement is never going to rise to the level of NATO Article 5 and so on. There won't be mutual defense. It's not going to be war against one, it's going to be war against all. It's not going to be that they will ever put their soldiers at risk, their lives at risk. Nor do I don't think we should expect it. To be very honest, as things stand today, I don't even think we need it. In other words, to be able to deter China, India's internal balancing plus what we will get through these external balancing arrangements, and we'll come to what exactly we will get from those arrangements, I think is more than sufficient to be able to deter China and secure our interests. Now, what do we get from those external balancing arrangements? For the large part, I think we get a couple of things. One is access to defense club goods, that is goods where there is a resource that has been deployed, which is made available to multiple people, and use of that resource doesn't deplete the resource itself. So for instance, logistics, right? So classic thing, right? You can use their logistics, their bases, you can use it for refueling and so on. They can use your facilities, right? So there's a classic thing that both of us can use of each other. Intelligence is another. US anyway has satellites. US anyway has technical intelligence which is tracking China. We saw during the border conflict as well, such intelligence was shared with India. Again, it's zero cost to them. They're gathering that intelligence anyways, right? So this is a classic defense club good, where you have deployed resources. You're not deploying a resource to help somebody else. You would have done it anyway for yourself, but everybody benefits from sharing that, right? So the classic defense club goods is what we can gain from the Quad-like arrangements. And let us realize that our interests span our continental border as well as the entire maritime space. On the continental border, we've literally fought a threat, and increasingly the maritime space will be important for us to secure. China is increasingly rising there. Now, we will not have, just, I mean, purely from an aggregate power standpoint, we don't have the resources to be able to fully combat the threat across all of these fronts. We just don't have the resources for that, number one. Number two, naval resources are far more expensive from a defense budgeting standpoint than even land resources. So you have a continental threat, you have maritime, this thing where also you have to deploy resources. So nobody's saying that you should shift away from a maritime orientation altogether. We need to be able to build that. But let's also recognize the resource constraints that we are up against an adversary who has 5 times the resources that you have. So one is to have them also fight across, or at least prepare to fight across multiple fronts. So China should be as worried about the entire South China Sea and that entire area. And again, their Quad helps from a Japan and so on. And a Quad plus will also help. Vietnam and so on will also help us, right? So one is their own resources get defrayed across multiple theaters. And the second is you're able to borrow resources. And the third is club goods. And the fourth will be for whatever is your own internal balancing, which is your own defense industry and so on. This may give you, this is yet to fully play out, may give you access to some technology, some arms and resources and so on, more preferentially than it otherwise would have been, right? But of course, the onus of internal balancing largely lies on us. But I mean, like partners who have capabilities, whether in the Quad or even outside, like a France and so on, does help in terms of your own building your own capabilities. So I don't think we should discount that, given that we are up against an adversary who has significantly higher power than us, and that power differential is not narrowing with time, right? So I think we have to be realistic in that context to say that this is not something that we can do on our own.
Yeah, I think I'll pitch in. I think I agree a lot with basically almost everyone that's spoken before me, and so I have far more confidence in what Quad can be than I think there's a good portion of Indian commentators that would not think the Quad is a good idea. I think, for example, it is a good idea, primarily because if you look at what has happened in the history, Mao does a revolution in China, Communist Party comes to power, Soviet Union very happy, everyone's good. And then suddenly, after the death of Stalin, Khrushchev comes, secret speech, and it is a Sino-Soviet split. Now, in around the 1970s, this is where China and the US are increasing their cooperation because they view the Soviets as a mutual threat. And, the Soviets and the Chinese have actually fought a war. I think it was 1969. They fought a border war. So it is not all good and great in the communist camp itself. So America comes, and after especially the death of Mao, you have Deng Xiaoping, and he says, we are going to take American support. We are going to take American economic support. And fundamentally, many of the so-called Indian communists who are, so greatly against American imperialism, they forget that one of the biggest allies of American support to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan was in fact the Chinese. The Chinese were training the very Uyghurs that they're supposedly oppressing today. So it is a very interesting observation. So I think in that sense, when you look what happened, the Chinese used the United States as a sort of, how do I say it? It's as sort of like a bridge to combat the Soviets, and the Soviets collapsed. And what the Chinese did is they used the American economic capital, they used America's industrial base, and they drained American industrial base completely. They take all the factories and it's all there. Now America does not have the means to build anything in their own country, and especially the ideology of neoliberalism, which says that anything the state does is communism and we cannot build anything because it is bad for our country. And that has effectively led to Chinese dominance in a lot of industries. Solar, I was just reading an article a couple of hours back about how the green tech and solar is somewhere that China has exceeded American sort of dominance over the subject, and even semiconductors is another sort of issue. So I think in that sense, this was something that China did. China grew out of American support during a time when it was Pax Americana, when it was America was a very strong power. But America right now is not as strong. America is fairly in decline. And by decline, I'm not saying that America is breaking apart like the Soviet Union. No. It means that America's sort of market share in geopolitics is being lowered compared to that of China. In that sense, this offers India a very good advantage point in that we can also sort of jump on the American bandwagon to counter China. And this does not mean, forming, like Akshay said, a NATO, or Christian said with like an Article 5 NATO sort of alliance. I don't think we have to do that. In that sense, I think what we can do is form a very strong economic bulwark to China. And I think that is what Japan was, for example. Japan was essentially, obviously their entire military was colonized, but Japan was an economic bulwark against Chinese communism and Russian communism, because they did not want the Japanese to become communist. So they invested a lot into Japan. And many people forget that before, all what America is doing with China right now, in the 80s, America did the same thing to Japan. There were, numerous Republican lawmakers standing outside the Congress, burning Japanese products, saying, oh, the Japanese are going to overtake us, and all the sort of articles that you're seeing right now about Chinese is the stuff you saw about the Japanese in the 80s, which is what led to sort of the Plaza Agreement, where Japan agreed that it would lower, I think it was fix its interest rates and currency rates, which led to the deflation of Japan and the economic crisis. And the reason America is pissed with China is because China is not willing to do that and subvert itself to American geopolitical interests. That is essentially what is happening. In that sense, I think that India has a very good opportunity. And like I personally, like I said, I believe in the concept of neutrality, but there has to be some sort of balancing that we have to do to ensure our own national interest, because China is our adversary and they are on our doorstep. It is not like, USSR is like thousands of miles away and America is even further. We can't afford to be just silently sitting in the corner of the room. No, we have the adversary on our doorstep, but we still have to ensure that we can milk both sides for their own benefits. In that sense, I think, when Akshay was saying about defense club goods and intelligence sharing and so on, I think that is definitely a very interesting sort of approach we can take. And I think American Defense Corporation, as long as it does not turn into an Article 5 sort of treaty, is a fairly good deal in my opinion. And at the same time, I think we can not challenge America, but like ensure that America does not dominate our defense priorities by continuing to buy from countries such as France or Russia. And I think Russia is one of the most important here, because Russia and China, dragon bear, big alliance, so they hate America and so on. But the Chinese, one of the biggest areas that they dislike about Russia is selling the weapons that India is using against China. So if we continue to, for example, obviously we have to create our own indigenous defense industry, and that is our top priority. But if we continue to buy from Russia and America, this will piss off China more and help create a rift between the Russian and Chinese interests, because Chinese are obviously going to be mad, saying, oh, you are our ally and you're selling the weapons to Indians that they are using against us. So in that sense, I think our main priority should be to be an economic bulwark against China more than a military bulwark, because honestly, we can take the military sharing expertise and a lot of logistical support from America, but our main goal should be to feed our own citizens, not to start a war. And I think if we want to deter China completely, we have nuclear weapons for that anyway.
So the interesting thing is that all the conclusions are, I agree with, I'm on board with most of the comments. The best thing is that in order to build an economic bulwark and everything, it hinged towards the third section of this debate, the domestic issues, which is inevitably be controlled by the bureaucracy. And so all these foreign strategies, they all depend on domestic changes at the end of the day. And it's a fact that economic interests of today are geostrategic interests of tomorrow. So of course we need to build our own capacity. And I think most of the foreign policy intelligentsia in this country, due to Cold War PTSD, we always think that the alliance with the US has a subtext of US domination in your domestic affairs or your foreign policy. But it has the definition of alliance has significantly changed. And we know that now the theater of Cold War 2.0 will be our borders. The closest we got was Afghanistan in the first one. This one will be multiple strategic and economic threats from China. So, of course, that's the only solution, that if we clear our red tapeism, build our state capacity, or, interest investors to come in India and invest properly here, when their interests are here, we are going to be the beneficiary of it. And also, because of the COVID, there is a strong consensus. I don't know whether it will materialize or not in policies, but there's a strong consensus that the myopic policies of the past have made their supply chains towards China, and this has actually affected their state capacity. So this is the best PR we could get if we sort our affairs, and gradually it won't be a it won't be a radical change in long term. If even 30 to 40% of the companies shift their supply chain to India or somewhere to a friendly country in Southeast Asia, so we don't have to think only about ourselves, but of a friendly country. If somehow it weakens Chinese economy, or West is more dependent on India or friendly countries, I think a lot can be done. And as far as the foreign policy expert, I think nobody cares. Everybody knows that Quad is not going to be an alliance like the NATO, and this was clear since the beginning. The thing is that with Quad, it's the diplomatic support we can get in major international organizations. Intelligence is a very important thing. Logistical support, uninterrupted supply of weapons, no threat of sanctions and stuff like that. That is how we can resolve a long-term problem. But it all depends on domestic changes, which can only be done by competent government and competent bureaucracy, which we will never have, I think, for next 50 years.
So I believe everybody has given their views. So Krishnan, if you would like to, or okay. So let's get to the second part of this discussion. And the third part will be, of course, as Karthik has very rightly stated, bureaucratic reforms. The most common and I would say the most talkative idea. But before that, let's complete the icing on the cake, and let's discuss about Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam in the context of soft power. Now, Akshay very rightly pointed out about the hard power aspects of Quad when it comes to the US, and I very much agree with that point, because you need the naval support of the United States, because even there are works which prove that the United States has proper naval capability, not for acting like a belligerent, because again when we talk about ASEAN centrality in Quad, because which is one of the most important tenets of Quad agreed by Pompeo, Jaishankar, and so forth last year in October. One important thing here is that the US Navy and the US Army can actually try to at least create a situation where the Chinese will be confused and the Chinese will get a sort of a resistance from intruding. We can take the South China Sea as an example, or maybe we can take any other part in the Pacific, or we can even take the Strait of Malacca for that matter, as a region for that matter. So in hard power, that is pretty understandable again. But as Ruchir has very rightly pointed out about the issue, we know that Americans will try from a cost benefit angle invest the least to actually lose. So of course that is very evident that the Americans won't do it too much. But from a soft power perspective, as we have been discussing, one problem which I very regularly see, and this has nothing to do with the partisan aspects or whatever identity stuff which is being discussed. In general, the problem with the consensus currently is that it's very unclear consensus. So as we know that in the times of Cold War, we had the NAM, we did it for show, part of which was good in on paper. Like I remember a letter by Prime Minister Nehru to maybe Vijayalakshmi Pandit about a discussion of some particular draft articles related to maritime law, which is which form the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. Now, what it is, it's about territorial waters and inclusion of any navy. So Nehru actually had some very interesting comments, which I find very resonating to what people say, that somebody should not intrude in our waters. But that was something which was much of an idealistic view, because it has been debunked that even in the past, in the 2000s, the Americans have come in the region near Bay of Bengal and so forth, and they have done some normal exercises. They are not even exercises; they are just normal practices of just patrolling and so forth. They are not technically under maritime law like that. So, but from a soft power, the problem is, I think that with Quad, and not just even Quad, I would even claim neutrality and China and so forth, our greatest neighbor Pakistan in that sense, we are unclear with what we have to do. Either we live in denial, or either sometimes what happens is that we just don't wish to even check our anthropological capabilities. And I'm not saying in a very rhetorical sense, I'm saying in a very pragmatic sense, because at the end of the day, soft power is also somehow important. It's not like McDonald's or KFC, of course, or it's not like Patanjali when it goes internationally, of course. But from a pragmatic sense, soft power means that, okay, fine, you have a knowledge economy concern. Then you have a concern of environment and climate change. We know that the European Union wants to have a Green New Deal. And experts have claimed that the Green New Deal idea of the European Union may be very utopian, but it may avert India from actually achieving what it wishes to do to economically develop. Despite the fact that India is, according to maybe a report by European Parliament, I don't remember, maybe January, India is the only country in the world which has abided by the Paris Accords properly. But I think there's a discussion on even in the Biden administration that the Paris Plus, I don't know, how would that be taken? So I would ask Karthikeya to firstly debunk about Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, and then the discussion can be channeled out. So yeah.
So yeah, that was a bad choice to begin this this part. But okay, so if we speak about the text where this comes from, okay, first let's begin with a very positive note that I'm very happy that our foreign ministry is not called foreign ministry but external affairs. It's a colonial term. It was the external ministry of Commonwealth, but then it changed and the government decided not to change it to foreign ministry. There are only few countries that call external affairs. Maybe I think Singapore also calls it external affairs. And I think that's a very good message on principle basis, that no men are foreign, no country, I forgot the term, but so that was a good thing, that okay, no men are foreign and it's external, not foreign to us. And to push that, there were like talks about Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, and Pranab Mukherjee, I think, said in the UN that Indian foreign policy means Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. Now the thing is that it's okay, but it doesn't mean the same thing, because in the text also, in Panch Tantra and Hitopdesh, where this comes from, these are stories that tell you that people who are going to trick you will use this. It says there's a story of Panchtantra. I think everybody has read that, about the four Brahmin brothers who try to bring back to life a lion back to life. So the fourth stupid one says that don't bring this lion back to life because he's going to eat you all. And the third, the smartest one, says that Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, we all are brothers, he is not going to kill us. And then what happened, we all know. So these are the warnings that were given. Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam as a principle, or as people talk about values of post World War welfare state and rule based stuff, and this is international values if there are none, but okay. So towards that, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam can make sense that okay, India has this principled approach that they are not going to unnecessarily make enemies out of people, and it's not a sort of asserting power who is going to be trying wolf for diplomacy like China. But as to make it as a main point of your foreign policy seems very weird. And this all, if you take into context that India is a highly risk averse country since forever, since Arjun also needs Krishna to tell them, look, okay, fight, come on. We always have this problem. And the 11th hour term, which we took from Bible, and we have used it in our domestic affairs. We always do all the things at the 11th hour. So either it's the student submitting its essays the last day of deadline, or Indian government procuring large defense when China has already intruded. So that's a national psyche we have. And when we had the war with China in 1962, we did not use our air force because there was a consensus that maybe this will risk a long-term war and China might bomb Kolkata. So what it gives you a signal that your adversary in Pakistan has a very clear concept that India needs to be destroyed by 1,000 cuts, and our legitimacy depends that we cannot have a peace with India. That's a basic premise of Pakistan state. China is also a clear thing that okay, we are the Middle Kingdom, and all these countries we are a tributary, and we are going to be the power, and all these people don't have anything of their own. It's all Western lackeys. Example India, but we showed our risk aversion as sign of weakness, and with our coupled this with our red tapeism and our issues with all sorts of not procuring things on time and this laid back attitude, lack of vigor, everybody sees it. It's not like it's a domestic affair, nobody's watching it, everybody knows about it. So at least if you want to pretend Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, actually at least have that capability that you can talk about idealistic abstract terms. Unless it doesn't make any sense. That's all I want to say about this, but I'm sure that other people have more insight to this topic.
Yeah, so I don't know whether Karthikeya wanted to say this Tamil thing like we have in Tamil called Yadum Ure Yavarum Kelir from Purananur. It just means that every place is my place, and every person is my kith and kin. I think Abdul Kalam says that in UN also. So what I see with this Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam is that the idea behind kind of enunciating or how do I put it, the idea behind espousing this Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam is not a bad idea to start with, because the way I see Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam is that it is one facet of a particular nation state, right? You want to project your power, whether it could be hard power or soft power, and then there are multiple facets to a state. And when we want to project our soft power side of it, and when we want to say that we want the world to be pacifist, at that time I think there is absolutely nothing wrong in espousing this whole Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam part. And I think Vaccine Maitri, or for that matter being the first responder in the region, those are all symbols of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. The problem is we sometimes begin to believe our own narrative in other aspects, right? Like we should know where we should stop with regards to Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. It should stop with where our hard interests come into picture. We should not delude ourselves into thinking that because of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam tomorrow Pakistan is going to come to the table, or China is somehow going to see that India's rise is going to be inevitable and therefore they are going to come back to the table. I think that kind of self-delusion is present in some corridors of the government, and that needs to be gotten rid of. So the problem is that when we get into such self-delusion, the pain points are much higher, and that is the reason we have started kind of derising this whole Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam term. And I believe in the current context, maybe critiquing Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam is not bad at all, but from a larger point of view, I think it forms that aspect of the Indian state that is soft, that is very with open arms. It is ready to help, and we should know where to stop it, but we should also be ready to use it as and when it is useful for us. That is with regards to Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. And I just wanted to add to the earlier point about neutrality that Alexei was saying, and also Akshay mentioned very early in this with regards to neutrality. I think serving our self-interest is by itself is a form of neutrality, without having to think about without going for a NATO type, or for that matter, a Japan or South Korea type alliance, as and when the situation arises, choosing our partners, and maybe when a combination over a certain time of time, we would have aligned with one particular nation much more than another nation. But those were all some of individual situation based alliances. They were not some grand strategy where we really wanted to say like that country's best interest is also my country's best interest. So in that situation is also, I think it's a case of neutrality. And I believe all middle powers, or like middle to big powers, will continue to exercise neutrality, and without kind of have the problem is that our bureaucracy does not think that way. It does not think in a y- how do I put it, in a decomposed time based individual event specific terms. They always I wouldn't say always, they have inculcated in themselves from the Cold War era. I really hope that such kind of education is not continued at Lal Bahadur Shastri National Institute of Administration these days, or at the Foreign Service Institute. Like it is still, it comes from the Nehruvian era that ideologies will determine your individual day-to-day diplomacy or day-to-day government-to-government actions, rather than that day's self-interest determining what you need to do. And then these sum of interest will in some way espouse what your national interest overall is. So I believe a lot of diplomats are coming out of that old skin and realizing that we have to kind of have a very issue-based alliance system. Uh, so that is with regards to like if the entire establishment realizes that definition of neutrality, I think we would get rid of the bad parts of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam as well as the bad parts of neutrality for our own good. With regards to defense deals that Karthikeyan mentioned, I mean, like defense preparedness, us going for last minute buys. Um, there is this I forget this name, like don't attribute something to malice what you can attribute to ignorance, right, or incompetence. I think that's part of the reason, like uh, we unfortunately we are still a capacity constrained country, and the domestic compulsions with regards to the budget kind of overwhelmingly outdoes the military aspect or the foreign policy aspect. I was one of the proponents of putting military front and center until like probably mid last year, especially the LAC situation kind of triggered me a lot. But then when one begins to realize that where our economic situation is, and where we are as a country, uh, I think yes, the government could have done more. I'm in no way supporting any of the past governments with regards to how they have handled the defense preparedness, or with regards to capacity building in terms of overall diplomacy. I mean, there are like recorded scenarios of how poorly we have executed our projects abroad, whether it is Nepal or Africa or any other place. And those are areas, if we improve, we would be able to really increase both our soft power and hard power. But what I see is that it is more of a systemic issue rather than an intent issue. It is not like we are intent on keeping our military or our foreign policy power low. It is just a reality of what our state capacity is, and how far we are ready to kind of invest long term in terms of our foreign policy arm. And yeah, so yeah, that's what I wanted to add.
Can I go next? Okay. So firstly, on Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam itself, it's a very noble view, but it's also a metaphysical concept, right? So if you see the original context in which it came up, in fact, it dates back even before the Panchatantra and Hitopadesa, right up to the Rigved. That's the first time it's actually mentioned. And if you read it in context, in the context in which it is mentioned, it is really about how, for an individual, when you attain that notion of being part of where the entire world is one, that is on your route, your personal journey to become one with Brahman, with the universal consciousness, right? So that is the context in which it is used in a very deeply metaphysical sense, and in that sense, it is very noble. and it is very valuable. It was never meant to be a how-to guide for foreign policy, and neither should we take it as any kind of like input for that, right? We have enough, even in our own literature, even in our own philosophy, and our own history. I mean, we have like from Kautilya, we have what would now be recognizably seen as a realist view of foreign policy, where essentially what you're doing is you're pursuing your self-interest as a state, right? Which is and should be the cornerstone of foreign policy, which is how are you securing your interests, right? And how and your self-interest, and everyone, and recognizing the fact that every other actor, which is every other state, is also looking to maximize its self-interest, right? So that's how you should approach the world of foreign policy, and that is how, like, historically also, I mean, even if you take the Arthashastra and all that, we have looked at it. So we shouldn't get distracted by a misreading and porting from a very different context, which is like a metaphysical context, and then taking it as some kind of an axiom of foreign policy conduct, which it was never meant for, right? So if you really want to like borrow from something, borrow from the realism of an Arthashastra and a Kautilya rather than this, right? While stipulating that is a very deep and noble thing, which in a very different context is very useful for all of us as human beings to try and inculcate, right? But that's on our individual spiritual journeys, not as a nation state which is pursuing its interests. Now, shifting gears a little to the broader concept of soft power, I think this is one thing which I would both want to define somewhat narrowly, and then kind of I feel India gets this often sometimes wrong when we talk of soft power. So firstly, what is power itself? Power is the ability to pursue your interests by influencing others, right? So you have power if you are able to achieve your interest, and you're able to bend somebody else's conduct also so that you achieve your goal, right? That's when you have power over them. Hard power, I mean, it's very clear what all the aspects of hard power are. It's your economy, it's your defense, and so on and so forth. Soft power, what is commonly like and very loosely referred to as soft power, to my mind, is no power at all, right? Which is to say that your culture has traveled somewhere else, or people like your movies or your food, or I don't know what else, but generally like all of this, or people, you get good publicity in the press. I mean, all these things to my mind don't matter at all unless someone can show that it is entering into the decision making matrix of an actual state. Unless that is happening, and I see no evidence of that, I don't see that as power at all, right? So it is, though it's called soft power, it is all soft and no power to my mind, right? What is soft power? And it is something that India doesn't possess, and I think we should be conscious of. Soft power is, like I said, power is really about pursuing your interests and influencing somebody else to be able to pursue your interests. Now, the ultimate goal would be, if you can trick somebody into thinking that, into defining their interests in the first place in a way that suits your interests, right? Then they are exerting all their energies, they are using all their power to be able to pursue your interests, just because you have convinced them that that is actually in their interest too. That, to my mind, is true soft power. And there are nations in the world that do possess that soft power, whether you take a US, whether you take a Europe, and so on. I would actually argue in that sense, though nobody in the West might be consuming anything major of Chinese culture or may love the Chinese or anything of that sort, the fact that for the largest part, people actually thought that a globalized world where relocating all your factories to China is actually like in your own interest, if you were the US or you were the West, to my mind, was extremely good soft power, right? For the Chinese to now weaponize the whole thing of racism to counter all the initial pushback that they were getting on COVID is again soft power. It is the ability to use somebody's own discourse, own concepts in a way that it suits your interests. So there are nations in the world that have soft power, but soft power is not culture. Soft power is not any of these things. Soft power is really about getting somebody else to define their interests in a way that it suits you. And very few countries in the world have that. India is not one of them. And more people doing yoga, as noble a pursuit as yoga is, more people watching Bollywood movies, again, as ignoble a thing as Bollywood movies are, still doesn't get you anywhere, because it doesn't change any decision maker's mind about what they have to do, which is what the purpose of power is. Purpose of power is to get somebody else to take an action or a decision differently from they otherwise would have, and in a way that suits you. Yeah.
Oh, that's an excellent summary there. I would, put it even simpler, that neutrality is meaningless without sovereignty, and soft power is meaningless without hard power. You have to first build the foundation, and then you can, talk about your values as much as you like. So, like, what so many people say, oh, India has such great soft power, or that America had soft power because of Coca-Cola and McDonald's, and now we have it because of yoga and Bollywood. But yeah, what soft power means is that the elite in other countries want to act in your interests, and they don't even realize they're acting in your interest. They think this is their free will, and it's like, oh, I'm doing the right thing for myself, but they're actually doing it for you. And India is a subject of Western soft power in that sense, the same way Mali is a subject of French soft power. People in West Africa go to a school where they are taught exclusively in French. They're told how great French civilization is. They're told that they're basically, French, they just haven't realized it yet. And you have to awaken the Frenchman inside you. Paris is the center of the world. Their minds are massaged by constant television and film that all comes from France. And then as a result, what is their society? It's an elite production line to send their best and brightest to France to contribute to the colonial metropole. Now that's soft power, and it's backed up by hard power because these countries are not fully sovereign even today. Now, in the absence of that kind of power, so India clearly doesn't have it. We're the ones, being subject to it. You can replace France and Mali with the US and India, or Britain and India. It's the same situation. So in the absence of that, all our talk of soft power is just a coping mechanism for weak countries to feel better about their own impotence. And all this, Vasudhaiva, Kutumbakam, that's for idealized situations, not for Kali Yuga. We live in the real world. The Arthashastra is about realism and foreign policy in the real world. I'm very glad that Akshay brought that up. And what we have today is that it's just a slogan. And just like in the past, we had Panchsheel. Panchsheel is a fantastic set of principles. I can read them out to you. So the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence are: 1, mutual respect for each other's territorial integrity and sovereignty; 2, mutual non-aggression; 3, mutual non-interference in each other's internal affairs; 4, equality and mutual benefit; and 5, peaceful coexistence. Now, we talked about Panchsheel for decades. We named neighborhoods in Delhi Panchsheel Park. Did we ever apply any of these principles in our foreign policy? No, it's a free-for-all. Come and interfere in our internal affairs. We have no sovereignty. Come massage our minds. Come, fill us with propaganda. Cultivate the elite. And yeah, we'll roll the red carpet for you. So that is how much soft or hard power we have. And we're constantly signaling, look at us, we're a weak state. We don't define our interests. We don't define our values. We don't define our policies. We talk about Panchsheel or Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, and people don't even understand. They ignore it. The rest of the world, they're like, India's back and it's going to talk about ahimsa and Panchsheel again. They're going to talk about the world is one family. What a joke. We live in the real world. The only real power is hard power. And you have to acknowledge that we don't live in an idealized world. We live in basically anarchy. Internationally, geopolitically, states exist in anarchy. There's no global constitution that has any force. There's no global police that's going to come and enforce your rights or guarantee your sovereignty. That's for you to do. That no one else is going to come and rescue us if we're in trouble unless we're willing to do it ourselves. If we can project that kind of strength, then others will be more incentivized to at least support us. But when we lack the will and the capacity to define and defend our interests, why would anyone else do so? And that's why we're a playground, or a playground for the great power policies of other countries. And we always have been. Even in the 60s and 70s, people used to say that it's like the whole country is for sale. You should read the archives of the KGB and the memoirs of the station chiefs of the Soviet embassy, the KGB station chiefs at the Soviet embassy in New Delhi, and they're laughing at how easy it was to buy Indian politicians, bureaucrats, journalists, professors, which they did easily. And so did the US, as some people got 2 paychecks this way. And even today, the same people are Chinese agents, the same people are American agents, the same people are Russian agents, if there's any left, or if there's any money left in that, because they all share the same goal, and that's to keep India weak, keep India unstable, keep India poor, because the world is very happy with the status quo. There's 5 big powers who won the Second World War, and as a reward, they got to design what the world looks like. The US thinks that it won the Cold War, and as a result got to design what the world looked like from the 90s onwards. Why would they welcome a new challenger that is strong, that's unified, that's wealthy, and capable of and willing to project its power? No, it's in their interest to prevent that at any cost, simply from a self-interest or national interest perspective. And we would do the same, as individuals or as a country, if we were in that position. No one's going to roll out the red carpet for a competitor, unless it was a very specific period in which they did that for China as a bulwark against the Soviet Union. Now, the question arises, to combine what we've been talking about, neutrality and then soft power, do we have the chance to leverage Western goodwill or a political, diplomatic, military power as a bulwark against China, as a country that is neighboring them? Or is it more likely that we'll engage in the kind of neutrality that Finland was famous for during the Cold War? Finland was the only neutral state that shared a physical border with the Soviet Union. The others, so Austria, Sweden, Switzerland, were a bit insulated. They were they had a buffer state next to them. But Finland, had a policy called Finlandization, which was explained in very colorful terms by certain foreign policy intellectuals. And they said, Finlandization is the art of bowing to the East without mooning, without flashing your ass to the West. Now that is something that would make everyone happy except our own people. So that's the outcome that we want to avoid, that we shouldn't be a servile country that has decided to make peace in order to maintain the status quo, because unfortunately we are a status quo country. We don't set goals for India. What will India look like in 2100, the way China does? And we don't see ourselves as a civilizational state with a clear identity and common vision and goals, whereas all our neighbors do. Pakistan does, Bangladesh does, Bhutan does, Sri Lanka does. They all have a very clear idea of what their state is and how it represents their values and takes these values forward. In India, all we're doing is protecting the status quo of either 1947, that, oh, yay, we got a state thanks to the benevolence of the British, let's keep everything the way it was and prevent another partition because that's very scary. Yeah, okay. That's classic risk aversion, that you're traumatized by partition and you're so scared that it'll happen again that you do everything in your power to keep things in that tenuous peace that you inherited. Or it's the post-1971 consensus, where we had the chance to finally discredit the two-nation theory when liberating East Pakistan after the Bengali genocide. And instead of reintegrating it into India as a new state, we've done that with other countries. That Sikkim became a state of the Union of India in the same decade. We're very happy to watch it turn into another Islamist state that continues the same policies that it did before. So, why, would we allow that? The reason is we don't have a strategic thinking in our bureaucracy, in our policy-making units, and everyone knows that, and we're constantly signaling it.
Yeah, I think so. I think again, starting off agreeing with basically everyone, whatever they have said. I think they're very important points, and I want to, build upon some things with my own sort of analysis and understanding. I think that every great power, superpower, or aspiring great power has some sort of a universalist ethos. What is their sort of claim to why they should be in charge of managing the world affairs. For America, it was human rights, democracy, and freedom and liberty and so on. For the Soviet Union, it was proletarian internationalism and all of that stuff. Now, the interesting thing is China does not have either of those two things. China is not exporting communist revolutions anymore. Even Deng Xiaoping stopped funding the Maoists, as far as I remember. And at the same time, they're not saying that you have to have some sort of Chinese-sponsored structural adjustment programs where you nationalize everything and so on. No, they're not doing that. The IMF is doing it. The Chinese are not. The Chinese are, obviously sort of colonizing Sri Lanka's port or something, but that is another story. But essentially, I think what I agree with the Akshay here is that we need to focus more on, Chanakya's Arthashastra and use sort of discard a lot of this Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam sort of ideology. But I think we can combine both of those ideologies. For example, I think the Arthashastra provides a very good realist base to achieve our material aims, to achieve our sort of aims of existence, of pursuing our own, foreign policy agenda. And at the same time, we can sugarcoat it with this Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, world is one, etc. I think these two ideas can go hand in hand as well. For example, especially with the vaccines apartheid that is going on, India and South Africa were the countries that said, we need to have the waiver of IPO patents. We need every country should have the ability to manufacture vaccine. And I think that follows very well with this sort of, whatever version of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam that our foreign policy establishment subscribes to. At the same time, I don't think Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam is something that we can work on with a state like Pakistan, the existence of which is dependent on the end and destruction of India and it's turning into a Ghazwa-e-Hind. Similarly, with China, their existence depends on the failure of our democracy, as Ruchir has highlighted. And so I think again, here, Arthashastra comes into play because, the entire circle of neighboring states and allying with people outside of the neighboring states and so on. I think those are very, very fundamental realist policy positions that we have ignored for ever since our independence. And I think, we had the chance with the 1971 war to take in a lot more territories of Pakistan. We had basically reached Lahore in 1971 on the western frontier of the war. And neither did we decide to absorb Bangladesh, nor did we decide to take in much more important strategic positions in Kashmir, nor did we decide to extend our border into Lahore. We did neither of those things. We said, okay, we're going to meet you in Shimla. We're going to give you your prisoners. Be happy. Oh, look, we are so benevolent and, we're mature power. And what did we gain out of it? Nothing. Bangladesh and immigration is still a problem. And, they're not as friendly to us as they were back in 1971. And I think in that sense, we have failed as having Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam as our national ideology of foreign policy. And that is where I think, the Arthashastra comes in very much into play. And we need a very, very strong development of a realist school of thought, which we have severely lacking in our country. And, on the topic of soft power, I think soft power, I would like to define, is when countries seek to emulate you without you invoking military force onto them. We call Bollywood is soft power. No, but I mean, it's a consumer product that we create that is creating jobs for our people, and that people in some corner of Nigeria or South Korea enjoy. Like, I have South Korean friends. They say, "Oh, Three Idiots was a wonderful movie." I said, "Yeah, obviously, because you like to study like these people as well. So naturally, they will like Three Idiots." But does that mean that South Korea wants to, create their own, movie industry that is trying to serve Bollywood? No. They're not casting Amir Khan in South Korean movies. That is not happening. If you want to look at Coca-Cola, I think Coca-Cola is a very good example of soft power, because it is not just that people want to consume Coca-Cola as a good consumer product, much like Bollywood. It is that America has been able to use Coca-Cola to conduct military coups, massacres, and genocides of people it opposes. In Guatemala, Coca-Cola has been responsible for funding far-right death squads that have killed union leaders, etc., etc. That, I think, is real soft power. Because soft power is, using it's allowing the country of Guatemala to better serve the interest of foreign multinationals of America without America actually having to send their own military. It is Coca-Cola that says, oh, we have the money, we're going to fund this right-wing paramilitary death squad, go kill this union leader, people want to consume Coca-Cola. I think that is a much, much stronger and realistic and, I would say, sort of violent assumption of what soft power is. So I think first, our foreign policy establishment needs to understand that we need to be a more realist country, and we are living in a state of anarchy. And I personally subscribe to realist and Marxist forms of foreign policy analysis. So in that sense, I think this Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam is a very good sort of layer of it's a very good coating, sort of like a boxing glove underneath the punch of our realist Arthashastra. And at the same time, I think we need to understand that our soft power is not Bollywood. It is a very good supplement to, woo the world and say, oh, snake charmers, look at our movies, fancy dancing and so on. But unless, we're getting people in Bangladesh I don't support violence, but if we're getting people in Bangladesh funding death squads to pursue the aims of our foreign multinationals based out of Mumbai, then I think we have achieved a victory in soft power.
This reminds me of a joke from the Cold War era, if I may. It's from the 70s, where an advisor comes to Jimmy Carter in the White House and says, "Sir, we've got intelligence that the the USSR are sending another manned flight to the moon, and this time they're going to paint it red." And Jimmy Carter's like, "Oh, that's fine. Don't worry. Just keep me posted." A few months later, it says, "Oh, Mr. President, the Soviets have reached the moon and they've started painting it red. What should we do?" He says, "Don't worry about it. Just keep me posted." Finally, after the whole mission ends, they say, "Mr. President, the Soviets have painted the whole moon red. What should we do?" And Jimmy Carter says, "Well, now send some of our boys and paint Coca-Cola on it in white." And that's how closely entwined Coca-Cola and US foreign policy were and are. That because the US has a system of legalized corruption, which is called lobbying, no matter who's in power, if a business is big enough, its interests will be represented by the state. The state, representatives, be they in the legislature or in the executive, act on the basis of their constituents. In the US, the constituents are not just the voters, they're also corporate lobbies who have funded their political careers. And they're beholden to them and essentially let them write legislation or let them write policy and make sure that it goes through. So it's a funny joke, but there's a huge kernel of truth in it.
Well, Charlie Wilson, when he was up for Senate confirmation hearing for his Secretary of Defense post, that's when he had retired from General Motors as I think board of director or a CEO, I guess. So he gets asked, how are you going to separate, how are you going to decide when an issue comes up that is going to affect the interests of General Motors but is going to help America? So he says whatever is good for the USA is good for General Motors and vice versa, right? So like they don't really feel shy about stating the fact, and it's not even a joke, right? It really happened, and that's how they are.
Yeah, I think I would like to I think this is, I'm not sure if you're transitioning that right now to the next topic, but, whenever you do, I think this is a beautiful quote that sort of summarizes mine and Ruchir and Krishnan's point, while also invoking a sort of bureaucratic argument. It is, I think, from Tony Benn, the great socialist English MP. He said that bureaucrats slow down policy implementation, while oligarchs blackmail governments with money and media. And parliamentary democracy is little more than a means of securing a periodical change in the management team, which is then allowed to preside over a system that remains intact. So I think that kind of makes sense. I think when Ruchir is saying whoever is in power, it is basically Coca-Cola that wins or General Motors that wins, according to Krishna. And I think that whenever we do transition to the bureaucratic sort of side, I think it's very important because, whoever comes to power, Ambani, Adani was very happy when Indira Gandhi was in power or when the Congress was in power, and then suddenly they're also happy when Modi is in power.
Great.
So let's get to the third, and I believe that is the kind of a second last to last a topic of this discussion, because the fourth one is generally about civilizational state. But the kind of discussion that we have been going through for at least an hour and so, I believe 70 or 90% of it has been already covered. So I think civilizational state something is like we should discuss it like a story every episode. So maybe the last part of this discussion will be about bureaucracy. Now let me make a context for everyone. So uh, we understand the problems with the external affairs, and as Karthik very rightly pointed out, the Ministry of External Affairs is a very colonial name, of course, after the Commonwealth it came in. And an interesting part is that we very well knew about these problems, because even the External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar himself stated, I think, in a discussion with HR McMaster or maybe sometime before, that in the past we did not have enough capacity, so it is actually very difficult to pull off even in the present. And of course, as Ruchir has often very rightly pointed out about the lack of strategic thinking, we always have it because of the very simple reason that we sometimes kind of, as India, uh, I'm talking about the post 1947 India, of course, we have kind of allied with those ideas who we found aesthetically very nice, as if we are just so much innocent and ignorant in that sense. And it can apply to anything. I mean, I am from law. I can say that it applies to even constitutional law, but that's not a discussion for now. So I'll give the floor to Karthikeya to give more brief on this, and then it will be disseminated accordingly. It can be said it's a bad choice, but I think it's a good choice. Actually, I believe it's a fundamentally brilliant choice. So yes, Karthikeya, please go ahead.
So because I write a lot about, I channel my anger on Twitter regarding bureaucracy. So somehow you think I'm the most qualified one to speak here. But see, I always find answers to every problem I face or the country face or whatever face in history. So there are two approach. Some people like the most, like abolish stuff and abolish that and revivalism and revolution. I don't believe in that. As a social conservative, I don't believe in rapid changes. It all happens gradually. First thing. Second is, so bureaucracy needs to be studied in a context. In India, we can't finish the bureaucracy. It's not about ending bureaucracy. It's about reforming it, making it better, more inculcate more expertise in it. Okay. Third, since Ashokan time, India always had a large bureaucracy. We can't work without a large bureaucracy. We need it. It's a basic fact. Even ancient time when Arabs conquered Persia, they did not kill any bureaucrat in Persia because Arab was not a empire sort of state. They had a very tribal understanding of governance, and they employed all Persians to govern the new new caliphate. So bureaucracy is very important and can change the course of the nation, either to success or to total annihilation. So now there are three things attached to it. If we see Indian civil service, it's the classical mediatory people, intermediary who are going to be speaking English and translating it to the local population. This was the main thing. And when colonization happened, and if you study history, you will see that England was not a very rich country at that time. There was a strong aristocracy and a very poor peasantry. And India also, since I think 1100s, never had a rich peasantry, always poor peasantry. Mughals time till now, always has been the poor people. They have always been poor. So when British colonization happened, a large number of subaltern or peasant or people who just got educated got employment to enter into the British colonization this thing adventure. And there was a emergence of a middle class in UK, which was not a thing before. And you will see that the country got rich, and there was this new class challenging the authorities and establishing their own aristocracy, so to speak. Until now, UK is a very, very classist society. If you see, when people were discussing about Jeremy Corbyn may become a prime minister, I don't think he will ever, or Labour Party will win anytime soon. But they were talking he is going to be the first non-Oxbridge person to become a prime minister. Now, this is the sort of discussion they are having till now. In India, it's a very subaltern movement since beginning. Now, where I'm coming to is when India got independence, and there was this entire population that has been deprived of any sort of economic empowerment or social empowerment since a long time. And Indian civil servants were basically people who were rich zamindars or rich English educated people. I can say that because a lot of one of my relatives have been an Indian civil servant, and they were from a zamindari family. And the British took all these people because they thought that they know how to govern, and they won't be. They are rich, so they won't be involved in corruption and stuff. This was the thinking at that time. When India got independence, a large subaltern movement got the opportunity to actually become civil servant. And this is why we see that most of the civil servants in North India are from Bimaru states, Bihar and Uttar Pradesh primarily, because they think that this is the only way to escape the, the cutthroat competition and the economic issues we face in India. So this new emergence of class happened because our society is like that. So there's a sociological problem as well, that a lot of people go for civil service job or government job to establish a kind of stability in their life, be it economic or whatever. And major crises we have seen in India, be it COVID or on, they have explained that if you don't have power or any sort of economic backing, you can't even get a hospital bed in times of pandemic. And all these social problems actually perpetuate a corrupt or a power hungry people in our societies. Basically, that's the sociological issue which we need to solve through government policies which actually aim to empower people and pull people out of poverty so that they can have basic dignity in life, to not to struggle to get a license, to not to struggle to get a bed in hospital. So these are the sociological effects which may solve the problem of bureaucracy in India. Second, and also one more point: if you read Jane Austen, you will see all these affection towards colonization and how servants are coming in our country because of some uncle is in colonies, some stuff like that. So you can see that a big transformation happened in England, and this is all also happening in India. This is the new emergence of power, a class which has power, which has been deprived of power for a long time. So this is the sociological aspect. And third, I will like to talk about the reformation aspect, that how can we change bureaucracy. So like Lord Acton said that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So all our policies have been very much relied on how bureaucracy actually enforced them. And India has always been an enforcement deficit country. Most of the policies have good intention, but they never reach the ground because in the middle there is a large bureaucracy that messes it up. And when I say bureaucracy, it's not about the civil services like IAS, IPS, and the allied services. It's also about all sorts of government services. Even a junior engineer in an electricity department is a part of a bureaucracy. So when I speak of bureaucracy, it's everything. Second, so this is the opening part. I think we can discuss the reformation later when everybody gives. I have some recommendations which I think I will discuss later. So this is my initial understanding of why we face this issue.
I'm happy to hear your recommendations now after that. There's not much to add. But Akshay, you were going to say something?
No, I was just going to share my own thoughts. But yeah, we can start with, because those are also recommendations. I mean, we can start with Karthikey's thoughts.
Actually, I was hoping to get a break, but okay. So
Then take a break. Let Akshay speak.
No, it's fine. So my initial thinking is that every department is very different from, like you can't expect a person who's coming from animal husbandry ministry to start, negotiating about Rafale fighter jets. That's why we have all the problems in this country. Because anywhere in any country, we don't have civilian MOD employees who are coming from district administration. Nowhere. They lack strategic thinking, they lack geopolitics, they lack all sorts of stuff. They have been managing a district by collecting taxes and living in a very colonial era bureaucracy, and suddenly they are procuring defense equipment for the country. It is never going to work. And I also believe that there are skills which you acquire while you work. And I want to give a benefit of doubt that there are many great bureaucrats in India who have been very good through this system as well. But I'm not generalizing, but there is this problem of not giving the right work to the right people. I personally believe that there should be a separate wing of district administration in the IS. That if you go into district administration, you will stay in district administration till the end. And this end should not be a job for life, 40 years, 45 years, because that is the end limit to reach the position of the DM. What happens now is that if you qualify IS at the age of 24 or 25, by the age of 29, you are a district magistrate. Now, district magistrate has a lot of power. Like, I can't even begin with. He is basically a monarch in a district. He has everything. And to give power to people at an early stage, of course, corrupts them. Now, this corruption is not only monetary, it's also about, blinded with power. And which is why we see people, going thrashing around people and recording it because they think that somehow they are doing great service to the society. So this is one. And I think the only and this is how we can divide services. Like there are, if I want to take revenue officers, I can make like proper exams for understanding how international tariffs work, how taxes are there, in comparative taxation laws, which people study. It's a proper discipline. You can actually divide services according to that. We need an exam for sure. I'm not saying that you change exam, it's not going to change anything. Exam should be there, but there should be time to time training in different aspects, academic as well as practical training, and then we can divide people. The only best, the better service which we have is the IFS. But the sad part is 90% of the IFS are the people who could not clear IS, and they somehow have to settle for a humble seat in South Block, which with bad offices and ceiling coming off, instead of being a king of a district. So that's the biggest problem. I think we should divide it. Like if you are signing for IFS, then it's only IFS. If you're signing for IS, then that's a separate thing. It's not a one common exam where you are somehow the knowledge how when elephants procreate, which season is good for them, and then you go in the defense ministry and buying procuring red weapons. So that's the basic understanding what I wanted to give to you all. So maybe that's the way we can change it.
Since you mentioned elephants procreating, another joke from the Cold War, this time from the Soviet side. The Soviet embassy in Delhi used to tell this joke quite often, that Indian policy making is like the procreation of two elephants. It happens at a very high level. There's lots of noise and trumpeting, and it takes 2 years to find out if anything happened.
That's really interesting. Sure. Should I go next? Yeah, I'll just keep it brief with an eye on the clock as well. So I think I'll confine my remarks to actually just the foreign policy bureaucracy and the ecosystem in which they operate. So firstly, I mean, the purpose of the bureaucracy, the foreign policy bureaucracy, is really again to pursue our national interests with the capabilities that we have, and to be able to strike deals which then enhance those capabilities, right? So if you take that as the goal, I would say that there are three things broadly that we need to focus upon. One is sheer capacity itself, right? And I'll come to that. The second is capability in terms of what defines our interests and how you pursue them, and having a broader view of that. And the third is really the capability that they have to plug into of a wider ecosystem, which they may not have internally within the bureaucracy. So let me cover each of those. So firstly, if you take capacity itself, I mean, it's already been mentioned several times. The point has been belabored. India has, I think, a sanction strength of 850 is a total foreign service level staff, that is IFS level staff, right? Which is clearly like very low for a country of our size and scale and our interests, the range of our interests that we have globally. Not only that, we also have a lower bureaucracy in the foreign service, which is again understaffed. So what ends up happening is that even your highly qualified diplomats end up spending a lot of their time, and I know this from like very close sources of like personal friends who serve in the foreign policy bureaucracy. I mean, it ranges from things like having to manage school admissions for diaspora people in Indian schools, let's say like in a foreign country, to this thing. This is what diplomats are spending time on, right? So not policy making. So I think just sheer capacity unlock, which by the way is not true of only the foreign policy, but a broader point of India in general, when it comes to things like police, judiciary, everything, we are significantly understaffed. So even if you take capability out of the equation and you just say sheer numbers, adding capacity by itself, I mean, is a big unlock. So that's point number one. Second, in terms of capability, I think we have to recognize that what we define as our national interest in this age requires a certain skill set of foreign policy bureaucracy, which is very important and wider than what it would have historically been. So, for example, we know that let's say trade and reshaping supply chains, getting investment into India, that these are very in a world where you have massive global capital, right? We live in a low yield global capital world, right? So many rich countries now have sovereign wealth funds which are looking for opportunities to invest. So that is one context. Similarly, trade has historically, I mean, over the last 20 years in particular, 25 years, has been a huge unlock for India in terms of growth. So to be able to strike trade deals, and we don't need to look very far, even if you look at our own neighborhood, I mean, one of the reasons that Bangladesh has catapulted is because of their preferential trade agreements that they have for textiles with Europe, right? So what you define now as your interests involves a skill set of your bureaucracy to be able to have these conversations, strike those deals, and have those deliverables on the table, right? So that is a very important thing for us to recognize in terms of how well-rounded the skill set and wide-ranging the skill set of bureaucrats has to be in this day and age for what we define as our interests. So that is the second point. The third is any such thing naturally will mean that you can't only have in-house talent, and we have to then figure out the organization structures which will involve not just reforms in the bureaucracy, but really reforms outside of it, in higher education, in how we think about the entire policy and intellectual ecosystem in India, such that people are able to plug into that expertise when required, right? Like how many experts do we have in the country who study China? How many experts do we have in the country who study Japan, right? And it can't just be like, this is the Japan expert, but if it's like, what is Japan doing on in the naval realm, right? Do we have like an expert who's like studying that deeply? Do we have like an expert who's studying only the CCP and their internal dynamics deeply, right? So when you have deep expertise on each of those areas and you can plug into that, that's when, I mean, you're able to bring in a lot of that thinking to foreign policy, which is what we will need in this era. So I think each of those three is what we should look at, which is just sheer addition of capacity, both in the higher foreign policy bureaucracy, but also in the lower bureaucracy, so that the most value adding activity is what the higher bureaucracy spends their time on. Second is capability, and that capability being more well-rounded to include things like economics across areas like trade and investment. And the third is really the wider intellectual ecosystem, and plugging into that and coming up with the organization structures to be able to plug into that. So I think all these three will be required for us.
Shall I? Yeah. So I think I I kind of feel like Akshay has stole a lot of thoughts that I had to say about the foreign policy bureaucracy. I almost share everything that he has said, but just a few points to add. Before that, to add to Karthikey's point of how the bureaucracy got formed, this is, in my opinion, like as he says, like the bureaucracy has come from how the British have shaped it during the colonial era, and then they have when they exited, they left the bureaucracy for us to fend ourselves. And as Karthikeya said, the subalterns look looked at it as an opportunity to kind of gain upward mobility rather than get caught in the rat race of trying to get a basic education and trying to make use of the minimal opportunity that would come by them. This is, I think, I'm paraphrasing Dr. Jaishankar when while describing how the foreign policy bureaucracy worked, but I'm extending it to the overall bureaucracy. Like between 1947 to I think almost like mid of 1960s or something, the entire bureaucracy with the patronage of the political leadership was functioning like just like a controlling authority. Like their idea was to ensure the integrity of the nation, the territorial integrity of the nation. Uh, Maybe that was the requirement of the times. We had to unite 500 princely states, and that happened like in some years. And then we went about, there were a lot of caste issues, caste fights that were going on. But the problem was that that kind of a mentality has continued to prolong till today, where the bureaucracy seems to project itself as a controller of the society's outcomes rather than as an enabler of the society's outcomes. They still feel that there is this very entrenched view that, and I'm pretty sure that this is part of the UPSC curriculum or whatever it is, that there is an entrenched mindset within the bureaucracy, and for those who aspire to be part of the bureaucracy, that if there is less bureaucracy in this country, there is going to be anarchy, and those powerful communities are going to literally just just destroy and disenfranchise and disable any agency for the marginalized or anything. I think that kind of a mindset has to completely be removed in today's context. I think we have through various social measures as well as through social media and a lot of other means, I think we've reached a stage where each and every community is confident in itself, is capable of defending its interests. Though I do believe that community interest shouldn't be, first of all, a point of discussion at all in a nation. But I believe that this mindset has to go while framing the rules and the responsibilities of any bureaucracy in our country. Like if we are going to go for reforms, that is with regards to the first part. And I think Karthikeya mentioned that the the various different kind of IAS or IFS, they need to stay their lane and kind of hone their craft before themselves moving from being a district magistrate to all the way to going to doing an international trade deal. That's true that it has not worked. It is not how it works in other countries. But there is an underlying reason as to why in other countries staying in the same field has worked really well. That's part of the reason is because they already have an established and well organized definition of interests, as well as a definition of the objective of that particular ministry, and they can really go about just specializing and updating themselves with each and every decade maybe, and how to go about achieving the national interest for their nation in that particular turf. But that because how I want to put it is like in those countries, the experience itself affords them the kind of education that is needed to excel in the next phase of their career. But that's not the case really in our case, where we have to depend upon a lot of intellectual learning in the first place, because we do not have a lot of systems in place for us to gain experience at the younger level before we could go to implement or like update ourselves from the lower level to the upper level. I don't know whether I'm being clear with regards to this. What I'm trying to say is like a young bureaucrat of the US being part of the USTR office, he or she would still be actively involved in negotiating for US business interests abroad at a really young phase of their career. But that may not necessarily be the case for an Indian trade or I mean like someone who is involved on the Indian side of things, because like Indian businesses have started going abroad much more only in the past 2 or 3 decades, and those who are in the twilight of their career may not really be experiencing what they have gone through. And that is for that is, I think that's part of the reason we are kind of forced to have like a more theoretical understanding of the domain. And I think that is something that, as you said, we have to go really gradually with regards to how we have to train our bureaucrats. And to complement to Akshay's point, I think we have, apart from the foreign service, we also have one of the lowest in terms of the trade cadre that we have. Like when we go for trade negotiations, I've heard like when we go for like a G20, G20 summit, or any economic or a monetary policy or a trade related summit, we are the least staff, and we are forced to take kind of consultants from the local regions who are citizens of who are Indian citizens, but they do work for foreign consultants, and they do this as a part-time job. Come in and help with help the Indian government with regards to expertise as and when they can afford. And I think that is a big problem. We need to start having really specialized trade negotiators who, and we need to have a really large trade negotiating cadre who can specialize, as you said, in the kind of economy, whether with regards to Japan or with regards to Europe or anything else. Because I think there are enough examples in the recent past where people just parachute in, do a term, and then go back with the updated resume to kind of go to their own job in the West to do to kind of proceed with their personal careers. And the problem with that is that India's national interest may not always combine with their temporary interest, which is to update their resumes for just as another point in their resume. And there is this funny thing about the Indian Foreign Service, right? Apparently, like it is really kept, the cadre strength is kept really low, apparently because they want to ensure that every grade A IFS officer gets a chance to become an ambassador. So, I mean, that's kind of a ridiculous criteria to have to kind of make sure that the cadre is pretty low. I think we really need to think of if those are the kind of narrow criteria that is defining the way our foreign service is being determined. God help us, that's what I can say. There are enough more powerful or equally relevant, I mean, not that it should matter in the first place while serving the nation, but there are enough relevant positions and enough power, enough positions of influence where an IFS officer could make a whole lot of difference. But then that would depend on the kind of decentralization of decision making and power that should be followed in the bureaucracy, right? This also kind of boils down to the way Karthikeya was mentioning about a district magistrate having enormous powers within his district. I think it at all levels we need to start decentralizing and kind of dissolving the powers to more number of bureaucrats rather than concentrating powers to a lesser number of people. And this may delay, I mean, one of the criticism about this is that it might delay decision making, but I think we've crossed the point where we have to kind of proceed with more powers being powers being distributed across a whole wider range of bureaucrats rather than resting on a few bunch of people. And finally, with regards to the Indian Foreign Service being kind of helping with school admissions, yeah, I think we still continue to be a very serving the elites who move abroad, or how do I say, like I think it's not just a facet of the Indian Foreign Service, it is also a facet of the Indian Administrative Service. Like I think people who have a friend in IAS, like it's a flaunting of your network or whatever you may want to call it. It's a sociological reason, right? As Karthikeya pointed out, you have to and the only way, in my opinion, that is going to happen is more decentralization of powers, like the district magistrate, the district collector, the deputy collector. Everyone should be having less amount of powers. Maybe we need to have more districts. Maybe we need to have more people in the bureaucracy. And then channel the interest in such a way that people will get the job done, rather than trying to trying to concentrate power with a limited number of people, in my opinion, is a very lazy and easy way out of governance rather than solving the governance problem itself. It's easy to concentrate power and then trust that the person with the power has the right motives and right incentives to do the right thing. But I think we have seen enough cases in history where it could lead to horribly wrong things to happen with regards to running a country. Yeah, that's it from my side.
So I think all of these issues that the three of you have identified, these problems with the Indian bureaucracy, the unfortunate reality of it is this is Indian bureaucracy working as it was intended. So this is what it's supposed to do. It's not that this is a failure. This is what it was designed to do. It's designed to be risk averse. It's designed to protect elite power and elite interests. And it's designed to focus more on the process than the outcome. And why is that? Where do all of these institutions come from? Where does the Indian Police Act come from? Where does the Civil Service Act come from? Where does the Indian Penal Code come from? They all come from just within a few years of 1858. So after the revolt or the First War of Independence of 1857, 1 year later after it was crushed, British rule in India was transferred from the East India Company to the Crown and became the British Raj. And they created state institutions that were designed to prevent a repeat of 1857 ever happening again. And what did that mean? It meant criminalizing just the normal behaviors of everyone. So regulating everything so that you can arrest anyone for any excuse and nip problems in the bud. To protect state power from the aspirations of the people, and to extract revenue for the crown. Why is the district magistrate, also called the district collector? Because it's his task to squeeze tax out of the peasantry. The building that the district magistrate sits in, the entire compound, which is the district administration, is called the collectorate, because that's where taxes were collected. Do any of our governance structures, our famous institutions, exist at the grassroots? No, they fortify themselves. So be it the police, be it the administration, they fortify themselves in this very nice green area where they live in big bungalows. The office is surrounded by guards. It's full of very intimidating and abrasive clerical staff who are designed to discourage you from bothering the high ups. And if you have a problem, do you phone the police and then they come to your village or come to your neighborhood? No, only if you're rich. Otherwise, you have to go to the thana and then beg them and beg and beg and beg to pay attention to you. With a high likelihood, they'll lock you up for causing trouble. There was an incident a few years ago where there was a young man in Bihar who went to file a police complaint because, of course, the police is not going to come to his house. He's poor. And he spoke English to one of the police officers. He asked, "Can you please tell me the name of the IPC code in which this is to be charged?" The policeman got angry. "Oh, look at this guy showing off his English. He thinks he's better than me," and beat him up and locked him up. Now, that's the level of government services that we have. So, of course, people are afraid of going to the police, afraid of going to the administration, afraid of a court case, because the court case is the punishment. No matter what happens in the outcome 10 years, 15 years later, the fact that you are now wasting your life, your time, your energy, your money, your youth on going to the court and being kicked around like a ball, that's the punishment. So it's not designed to serve citizens and empower them with rights. It's designed to keep the natives at a distance so that they don't have the opportunity to question or challenge the established order. Now, generally, when there is a historical change in governance, and that could be, for example, the end of the caliphate in Turkey and Ataturk came to power, one of the first things you do is create a new penal code, create a new civil law structure, create a new civil service. Or another example is in the 90s. In Eastern Europe, Central and Eastern Europe, you had countries like Hungary and Poland and Czechoslovakia who transitioned from being socialist countries to modern liberal democracies. They passed laws called lustration laws, which allowed the state to hold hearings against any bureaucrat, any academic, any government, anyone who drew a government salary could be called publicly in front of a panel, in front of a tribunal, in front of a judge, and people could raise their complaints. And if this person was found to have been acting as a party stooge or oppressing people, they were removed from the service, and that allowed for a renewal of the government services in those countries with a new mentality, be it community policing instead of barracks policing, or be it populating the civil service with people who believed in the new constitution and weren't just actively working to sabotage it and go back to the old ways because that's what they're comfortable with. That's something that we didn't do in 47. It's something that we tried to do in 77 after the emergency, but failed because the civil service is too strong and sabotaged it at everywhere, and the judiciary is the same. It's something that we should have done in the 90s as well. When we had economic liberalization, we didn't pursue political liberalization as well. In every other country, the two went together as a big bang moment, but we still have colonial era extractive government institutions which are process oriented, don't care about the outcomes, are status quoist. Their obsession is keeping the things the way they are because they're comfortable with the way things are, and that needs to be shaken up. So you need radical reforms at every level. That at recruitment needs to change. There's various other models. You should be able to hire people at any age, not just by giving the exam. Some percentage of them, sure, can come through an exam. The exam can also be widened. So Singapore makes people give the exam in high school and then grooms them from the age of 18 to be the ideal civil servant. Whereas countries like in Western Europe, you can, or the Anglosphere, you can join a government job by applying for it like any other job. You apply for it, you get a 3-year contract. If you're good, you'll get promoted or extended. If you're bad, you'll be weeded out. France and China have the civil service system where they have the academy, but France is dismantling it now and replacing it with a new institution and a new exam because they felt that it was simply a school for breeding generation after generation of elites who all thought the same and all had the same networks and were just running an old boys club. And China has had the longest history of civil service exams for thousands of years. And it's an imperial Chinese invention. But at least now they test their knowledge on things that are relevant to their party and state, because there's a consensus on what the People's Republic of China stands for and what its goals and ambitions are. Then, that's recruitment. The second is contracts. Nobody should be on a permanent contract anymore. They need to fear losing their jobs, so they should be on short-term contracts, 3 to 5 years. Right now, they're on 3 to 5 year cycles of transfers, but that's abused. Because let's say if you're the rare honest officer, you'll be transferred 6 times in 2 years as a punishment for getting too involved or asking too many questions or bothering your political master. So politicians should not have the right to transfer you. And purely internally, there should be an internal tribunal and HR system that allows for contract renewals, disciplinary action, and promotions. Then, apart from that, there should be constant training. So people should constantly be learning. It's not that, oh, you just passed the exam and now, here's your career red carpet, run with it for 30 years. Whenever you want to get promoted, whenever you're being moved from one department to another, it should be a 6-month training program. You have to pass it. You have to take it seriously. If you pass it, you make it to the next round. And people say, oh, it's impossible to reform the civil service because, who's going to implement it? The civil service themselves. Well, you have to put the fear of God into them. Tell them, if you want to be paid, if you want your children to eat, if you want your children to afford the fees at Harvard where you keep sending them in Oxford, then you'll do what you're told. You're a government employee. You're called a civil servant for a reason. You're not an entrepreneur. You don't own the country. You don't run the country. You do what you're told. If you don't like that, you can take voluntary retirement and leave. But these are the new rules. you follow them. And if you don't follow them, there are literally 10,000 people for each position who are willing to replace you. They'll, you can cut the salary in half, they'll still do it. There are people who'll do it for free. And if all else fails, you can always do what they're doing anyway, is hiring McKinsey consultants to do all the legwork and then taking credit for it. So, you have to be bold. You have to, as Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso said, he was a great radical reform of the bureaucracy. You have to have the courage to invent the future. You can't just live in the cage that was made for you by the colonizer, thinking, oh yeah, it's a very beautiful cage, and if I change it, the world outside is scary. Yeah, everything's scary. Live with it, and equip yourself with the tools to deal with it.
Yeah, so I think, again, concluding here once again, but I think I agree with, again, what everyone has said. A lot of interesting points have been raised. But I think what I did was, before this conversation began, I decided that I am going, since I'm graduating in about a week, I think, and I don't know if my university sort of, academic, institutional paper login will still work or not. I decided I'm going to download all the sort of academic papers that are available on JSTOR and all of that stuff. And I decided I'm going to make use of it and see how other countries run their bureaucracy. And so essentially, I discovered that there are 3 ways that you can go forward with the Indian bureaucracy, because I think what Ruchir was saying is the bureaucracy is working the way it is intended to, because it is a colonial bureaucracy. It is meant to suppress the people, not to give economic growth. It is supposed to manage the people and and so on. So how do you get out of it? There are 3 ways. So I have 3 examples. One example is what the European Union has been doing. The second example is what China has been doing. And the third example is what Singapore has been doing. Now, I chose these 3 specific examples because European Union is something of a sort of neoliberal ideal that our Indian elites, after the collapse of Soviet Union, wish to look up to and wish to emulate. And it is something that I think we are seeing more and more with the sort of privatizations that are coming on. Second, I chose Singapore because Singapore was a former British colony, and they reformed their civil service with a lot of necessary and strong reforms that helped to ensure that they could pursue a sort of state-led development model where the state reigns supreme and coordinates a lot of efforts. And I think that was very successful model for their economic growth. China, on the other hand, because China comes into the scale factor of China as a country with 1.4 billion people, oldest civil service examination, and India has the comparative sort of size when you look at China. And China's reforms, when Deng Xiaoping came into power, were obviously modeled a lot after Singapore and Japan. So I think these 3 examples come into play very, very intertwined, I would like to say. So the first example is the European Union. Ever since the collapse of the Berlin Wall, what have we seen with the European Union? There is a German term, and I think Ruchir, with his experience in Europe, would be very familiar with this. In German, it is called McKinseyisierung. It is the McKinseyization of your bureaucracy. What does this mean? It means that I am not going to prioritize my own state's bureaucrats. I am going to pay money to McKinsey, Deloitte, Bain, and all these private consultancy companies. And I am going to essentially privatize my bureaucracy. Now, this obviously hollows out the state capacity, but since we are in the neoliberal era, nobody cares about the state capacity because it is all about corporations and so on. So what this has led to? In France, it led to the horrible vaccine rollout policy, so basically France decided for COVID, they're going to have McKinsey coordinate their vaccination rollout policy. France has now administered less than 40% of I think it is about 35% of doses to their citizens, first dose, right? This same number was achieved by the UK, which just did Brexit and used their state instead of McKinsey. They achieved 35% vaccination 4 months before France did. So this shows us that just thinking the private sector is going to sort out for you, I think is a completely stupid idea, because their main aim is profit, not service. And they're going to take this contract, they're going to get the profit, and they're going to get out of it. They don't care how well it is done, they care about profit. That is what McKinseyisierung means to be. And Germany, obviously, because it's a German word, it came from what Germany did. So Germany implemented this with their migration policy and their asylum seeker policy. They said that we're not going to use our state completely to manage the inflow of mass immigration coming from Syria and Middle East and so on. We're going to use McKinsey, and that screwed up their entire asylum process, and there was a lot of tribunals that had to be sorted out. And essentially, it's such a bad sort of migration policy that it led to the rise of the Alternative for Deutschland party, which is the far-right nationalist party. It led to the left-wing party of Germany under Sarah Wagenknecht to adopt an anti-migrant stance because of how bad the migrant situation was. And it is now led basically after the collapse of, after Angela Merkel is going out of office, you are now having the German Greens coming in. So I think in that sense, we can see that, I am not some sort of ultra-Stalinist that hates the private sector and believes the entire economy should be nationalized and so on. I don't believe that. I think the private sector can play a role where it deserves to play a role, but when it comes to your own country's bureaucracy, I don't think it works. And Europe has been a wonderful example of how not to manage your bureaucracy. Now, moving on to what Singapore and China have done, aka the more successful examples of bureaucracy that show you that big government is not a problem. Now, why do I choose big government is not a problem? Because, well, since 2014, we have had a party that thinks minimum governance is a good ideology. He has expanded the welfare state, so I will give him credit to that for that. But I think privatization is something that is going to hurt us a lot. But yeah, so why do I choose this? Because, okay, if we look at public employees as a percentage of total employees in the labor force by country, libertarian United States, this ratio falls to 14%. 14% of American employees are working in the public sector. In Singapore, it is 33%. 1 out of every 3 workers in Singapore works in the public sector. In socialist China, it is 50%, which is 1 out of 2 works in the public sector. In Cuba and Azerbaijan, it is 3 out of 4. 3 out of every 4 employees works in the public sector. If I told you the number for what it is for India, you will laugh, because the number is, first of all, below 15%. It is below 10%, and it is even below 5%. It is 3.5%. 3.5% of our country's employees work in the public sector. And if anyone basically tells you that you need less governance when you basically have a ghost state, is calling for privatization. That is clear cut. And like I said, privatization has been a disaster in Europe in terms of bureaucracy. So what do? There is Singapore and there is China. So what did Singapore do after it gained independence from Britain and obviously Malaysia? It created state-owned enterprises, and it ensured that the civil servants obviously take examinations and so on, but the salaries for the civil servants will be according to the market rates. They will be according to what the market is showing the salary is going for. Now, why is this important? Because a couple of days ago, Indian public civil servants saw a 10% wage rise. During where they enforced a lockdown, which led to the destruction of this country's middle class, the only 2 groups of people that saw their wages increase were billionaires, like Adani, Ambani, and so on, and the public bureaucrats. Now, I don't think this is an acceptable sort of situation in a country where you have decimated your middle class, your unemployment rate is skyrocketing, and so on. So what you have to do, I think I agree with Ruchir here as well, you need contracts and you need a sort of HR and training program. And what Singapore did was a public service 21st century initiative, which had 3 key points, which was to anticipate the future and create scenario-based plans for what you wish to see happen in the future, have a positive attitude in the sort of ministry and within the employees, and ensure that effective change is implemented. And these reforms were meant to be more employee-centric, to give them greater agency, while at the same time ensuring they have a positive work environment, but not creating the sort of Babu monarchism that you have with district magistrates, as Kartikeya mentioned. So what does Singapore do to ensure the performance matches onto standards? They do yearly appraisals where they grade each civil servant on a scale of A to E, And they're very clear. If you do not maintain the standards, they are very, very open to firing you. They have enough people waiting in line to be civil servants, right? And at the same time, every year with the yearly appraisal, they have this thing called a current estimated potential, where they see, based on your performance in the past years or how much ever time, they say, okay, we see that this person has the potential to expand his role here, he will be much better here, and then they are either shuffled around or they're promoted and so on. So I think this is something that we lack in our Indian bureaucracy, which is, first of all, we don't have the numbers, which leads to people higher up in the bureaucracy having to do menial tasks which they should not be doing, slowing down implementation of policy as a result. And this creates a lot of backlog. But what Singapore does is very simple. They say, we're going to have a lot of people in our government. We're going to have yearly appraisals. If you do not meet our standard, we're going to kick you out. If you meet our standards, we're going to appraise you and see where you can be in the future. So they have some sort of a planning here. Now, in that sense, I think Singapore has done, obviously, a very good job. They have shown, as an example, that you don't need to have a Soviet-style nomenclatura central planning. At the same time, you don't need to have a fully privatized, neoliberal order. Singapore has treaded the midway path. And this has been very, very efficient for them with the state-led development model. This was, the Asian tiger model of Taiwan, and even South Korea and so on. And I think big government as a state-led industrialization played a very, very significant role. Now, I think the country that put this to scale is China. Now, when Mao came into power, he kind of took the Soviet era bureaucratic system, but I wouldn't say reformed it, I would say deformed it to ensure that his own survival in power remains. And this was very influential during the Cultural Revolution because, after the failure of the Great Leap Forward, even invincible Supreme Leader Mao had to step down. And then with the Cultural Revolution, he came forward. So these sort of Red Guard bureaucrats as well were helping implement his Cultural Revolution in the countryside, denouncing teachers, arresting people, so on and so on, to ensure that Mao stayed in power. And obviously Deng Xiaoping saw the Cultural Revolution, extremely horrified by it. He was also, as far as I remember, he was purged during the Cultural Revolution, but was brought back later, obviously, as leader. And he reformed the civil service extensively. Now, China has, so Winston Churchill, you might have heard of, has this quote that democracy is the least worst system it is, that we have. And, people say they have better systems, but democracy is the one that seems to work, and it is the least worst system. The Chinese in Mandarin call it the xia xia zi. But what the Chinese instead follow is what they called, they need best and high caliber leaders only. And what they call the system is the Shang Shang Tse, which is obviously, like I said, best and high caliber leaders only. So what does the Chinese bureaucracy have that is different from the Singaporean bureaucracy? Well, obviously, China is a one-party state. So every single bureaucrat is a member of the Chinese Communist Party. And there is no distinction between party and state. If you are in the bureaucracy, you are to be guided by party principles, receive a party education. And, unlike the BJP, which is a mass party, the Chinese Communist Party, ironically, so to speak, is a very elitist party. You have to, give exams to first enter the party. And then they, talk to your neighbors, like imagine you're joining CIA or something. And then they take you in the party. The party is, I think, membership is 85 million. So, less than 1 in 12 people in China is part of the Chinese Communist Party. But if you want to be a bureaucrat, you have to be part of this party. And what China has instituted is what it calls the Central Commission for Discipline Inspection, which is like a sort of separate government body that ensures anti-corruption is enforced and discipline and transparency is enforced, obviously, to feed the goals of the Chinese Communist Party. Transparency not as this liberal virtue of open society and so on. No, it is transparent for the leader of the Politburo to know what is going on, and that is what they're doing. I also had a look at how the Chinese bureaucracy is divided. There are 15 levels of Chinese bureaucracy, and obviously in the bureaucracy, Xi Jinping is also part of the bureaucracy because, like I said, there is no distinction between party and state. So on the top of bureaucracy, you have Xi Jinping, then below that you have Politburo and so on. And then bottom down, you have the lower level bureaucrats. And the percentage division of these things is as follows. So only 10% of bureaucrats work in the central level. To manage the entirety of China, there is 10% of bureaucrats. 11% of bureaucrats work in the provincial level. 20% of bureaucrats work in the prefecture level, which is below. And 41% of bureaucrats work at the county level. And below that, 15% work at the township level. So essentially, this shows us that there is not over-centralization, as many people think the communist sort of system has. In fact, the communist system is very decentralized in its implementation, in its structure. But obviously, the orders come from above, obviously. But in terms of, it is a very, very decentralized structure because you have essentially more than 50% of your bureaucracy is working in a city alone, right? And then above that, you have the prefecture as and then you have provincial and central sort of administrations. And another interesting sort of aspect here with bureaucracy, and it obviously ties back to our foreign policy as well, is what do we want the purpose of our nation to be in the coming 5 years or 10 years? And I think this is why having 5-year plans is a very good thing, because it allows us to see what our purpose is. Now, China's purpose during Deng Xiaoping was to industrialize. So that is how they dealt with their bureaucracy. The bureaucracy's aim was to ensure the factories are running on time, the unions are not striking, because as much as the communists love to idolize China, you have to first seek the government's permission to be able to hold a strike. Strikes are not legal in China, surprisingly. But so yeah, you have to essentially understand what is the purpose of your country and its economic aims, which was at the time to industrialize China. So it was to maintain a cordial relationship with state-owned enterprise, with the national bourgeoisie and the labor union. Then afterwards, when they had reached the sufficient stage of industrialization and they became the world's topmost industrial power, displacing Germany, the aims shifted under Hu Jintao. And the aim was then to innovate. And this is around, I think, slightly before Hu Jintao, around Hu Jintao, we saw the rise of Alibaba. We saw the rise of national champions, conglomerates which were either state-owned or private, which were essentially working to innovate and do research and development. And I think we saw a couple of days ago that China officially passed the amount of money it spends on research and development over the USA. China now spends more money on research and development. And bureaucracy obviously plays a very important role, because the research and development and RDI that is being done is mainly done by the public sector. The private sector almost always appropriates it. This is the case for the United States with their Department of Defense grants and so on. This is the case with China. This is very much the case with India. Private sector does not do research. It takes the research and profits off the research. So this is where I think, we have to understand, firstly, what is the purpose of our country? And to understand that purpose, we need 5-year plans. Secondly, we need to ensure that there is a fear the bureaucrat has of losing their jobs, and their pay has to be pegged to the market rate. Third, we have to ensure that the mindset of bureaucrats is corrected. And I think this is one thing Singapore did, is they had a lot of training sessions where it was very psychological as well, where they told you, you're not the colonial era bureaucrat. Your aim is not to suppress the Chinese population and so on. Your aim is to grow the country. And I think that mindset change also needs to be there, and we need to educate. We also have to ensure that there is a broader decentralization of the bureaucracy. And at the same time, we have to ensure that the bureaucrats are skilled, and we have to expand the powers of the government. By powers, I mean, obviously, the numbers. Our IFS has a horribly low number of staffers, because I think one of you mentioned everyone wants to be an ambassador. I don't think that is a very good idea as well. And I think this is where we have to learn not from the West, which our colonized elites love to emulate, be it Soviet Union, be it America now after Reagan and Thatcher, even though the Republican Party is ditching Reagan himself. Our Indian elites still think that we need to emulate Ronald Reagan 50 years after he's dead. 50 years after his rule. Sorry, he's not dead for 50 years. So in that sense, I think, when we say look east, we actually have to learn from the East and how they developed their own country. Because this is a model of development that every single country that used was 100% successful, be it Taiwan, with their state-owned enterprises, be it South Korea, which surprisingly nationalized all their banks. They had no independent private banks, and they had 5-year plans. You may think this is some socialist paradise, but this was South Korea during their best sort of phases of growth. They had a strong state. This is also the case with Vietnam, which the World Economic Forum says has the most sustainable economy and a sustainable path to economic growth and dominance. And at the same time, this was done with Singapore and even China. So I don't think that, we have to emulate too much the West. We don't have to go full-blown, socialism on the path of the USSR, because that is dead. That is never coming back. We don't have to go the path of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher and privatize everything, because even Boris Johnson in the UK is partly nationalizing his railways because it was such a horrible failure. And at the same time, we have to realize that much of our answers are in our own neighborhood, based on the material conditions of our own neighborhood, which is the state guides the private sector and the state sector to implement a sort of national goal, while ensuring that there is a cordial relationship between the bourgeoisie of the country and the labor of the proletariat of the country. So yeah, that is basically.
Yeah, great. So I would say that I was quite mesmerized by it. And we go with the concluding part of this discussion. So let's have 1 minute, I would say, feedback, or I would say concluding remarks from everybody in a clockwise manner. And then maybe we can end, because I believe that in all the 3 sections we have discussed a lot. And second, we are running out of time also. So let's go with a 1 minute conclusion for everybody. And then I will conclude in the end. So we can start with Akshay, then Krishnan, then Karthik, and so on.
Yeah. So I think just to conclude, what I would say is that the topics that we covered, which was neutrality and Vasudhaiva, Kutumbakam, and then finally the bureaucracy. I think first, I think we have to recognize the global context that we are in, where the world order is changing, and our primary adversary in our own neighborhood is the great power, right? So that's the first thing that we have to recognize. Given that that is the case, I think neutrality, at least in the form that was there in the first Cold War, is not a tenable strategy at all, right? Thirdly, I mean, a full-fledged alliance with the US is neither on the tables. It's not desirable or feasible, but we will figure out our own model for how to build both internal and external balancing with a range of partners, which includes the US, but not only them, other Asian powers as well, who are also concerned about a rising China. To do that, I mean, to enable this, I mean, we do need significant reform in the foreign policy bureaucracy. And we need to focus a lot more on hard power and get away from this notion, the distorted version of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam that we have, and any delusions of soft power that we have, which won't be backed by hard power. So I think we need to squarely focus on hard power. And we need to reform the bureaucracy in order to have a kind of ruthless pursuit of national interest. And for that, there has to be an increase in both their capabilities, but also the sheer capacity of our diplomatic corps, but also the non-diplomatic foreign policy staff. So enhancing their capabilities as well as their sheer numbers, I think, will be quite important for us to capture the opportunities that we have in this new world order.
Yeah, so I'd like to pick on what Akshay said at the last. That is the ruthless pursuit of national interest, right? I think we need to be ruthless in whatever we do. We need to be firm-footed, whether it is bureaucratic change, or whether it is with regards to pursuit of national interest, or whether it's regards to building our military power. Maybe I'm just repeating what Akshay said, like without hard power, soft power is just soft, no power. I think Ruchir mentioned that. Yeah. So soft power is so it's like soft power is it's power only for those who are at the table. It is just soft for those who are on the menu. So soft power is just nothing. Yeah, so the thing is, we are at a state of flux where the world will decide in few years whether China is a great power or not. Like whether China has appeared as the second pole with a decreasing US. So I think this time of flux is the best chance for India uh, to be aggressive and to be assertive, and we should not be hedging. We should make up our minds, and we should be firm footed in whatever we do. And by hedging, I do not mean that we stop balancing between powers, but we should not be hedging between our own riskless ideas versus risk prone ideas. I think this is the time we should be taking maximum risks as possible.
So to conclude is that our international standing depends a lot on domestic capacity, and policy changes and development in the domestic affairs is going to amplify in foreign policy. And an effective capacity would ensure that realism and efficiency is in within the state capacity, and with realism and efficiency we can get more realistic about the deterrence theory and building a capacity, or making alliance which are beneficial to us, and many other great things will be achieved. And when we are in that position, then we'll be qualified enough to talk about national interest or changing the rule based order, or asserting our civilizational principles. That's all I want to say.
Yeah, so I think this has been a very illuminating discussion, and I think learning a lot from Deng Xiaoping would be very helpful to our own Indian elites, primarily because we must, first of all, seek truths from facts. We have been living in an idealized world, and I think when we seek truths from facts and expand our own state capacity, only then will we be able to have the ability to export our soft power and have the hard power, to deter Chinese aggression. And I think bureaucracy would play a very important role in the development of our country, and at the same time would play a very important role in the development of our foreign service. And we also need to, at the same time, have a national vision, a plan, so to speak, of what we want our country to be. Do we want to ensure we have industrialization? Do we want to be an economic bulwark against China? How do we wish to play off the US to ensure that they are, instead of bringing jobs back home, they're bringing jobs from China to India, etc., and so on. So I think there is a great debate that is going to be there in the future on how we're going to reform a bureaucracy and how that is going to serve the greater agenda of what we wish to achieve, both domestically, economically, and in terms of foreign policy. So yeah.
Great. And so then I'll summarize based on the points that we raised. So firstly, on neutrality. So if we are to remain neutral or non-aligned in the second Cold War as it's developing, there's only one way to do that, and that's through proactive neutrality, where you boldly pursue your national interests through transactional relationships. Have a relationship with both sides, get whatever we can from them, as long as it's in our self-interest, and that will also create some value to our cooperation. Right now, we're just happy to be involved. No, we need to define our national interests, and then based on that, say yes or no to each country on each issue on a case-by-case basis, and then it means something when you have India on board or when we get another country on board. Secondly, so Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam is not for states. It's for individual behavior in an idealized dharmic monarchy, not for geopolitical anarchy, because countries exist in anarchy, as we've established, and we already have our own philosophical models for geopolitics, and that can be Chanakya Niti, which is our indigenous form of political realism, or it can be the Mastya Nyaya, so the rule of the fish, big fish eats the little fish. Very simple concepts that have unfortunately been robbed from us, that we were not even aware of the existence of the Arthashastra until the 1920s when it was resurfaced. So that's something that has not yet permeated our governing structures. And finally, the third point that we discussed, our institutions or our bureaucracy, our governing structures, it is not inevitable that we will become a superpower or a developed country. It's very likely, in fact, it's more likely that we will stagnate as a middle income country and end up like a Latin American country in the best case scenario, and the worst case scenario, like an African neo-colony, having lost even our economic and political sovereignty, and just pretending to be a modern state, but everything being directed from abroad. The way to prevent such an outcome is to radically reform the state and its institutions, because these are not our institutions. We've just inherited them from the colonizer, who designed them for a very different purpose. And yes, the British loved the civil service and the judiciary system, and our post-colonial elite loved it as well, because from their perspective, it does what it says on the label, and it does it very well. The problem is, what it does, its intended purpose, is not in line with the aspirations of 1.3 billion empowered citizens. So we're not subjects anymore who the state needs to protect itself from. We're citizens. The constitution, comes from us. It's the people who are sovereign. We, the people of India, created this constitution, and the state is obliged to serve us as citizens with rights, and not look at us as pesky subjects who are constantly at risk of violence and uprising and civil war with each other, who need to be suppressed and calmed. Now, one other thing we have to keep in mind, we've talked a lot about China, thinking that we're an equal power to China, but quite honestly, we're not equal to China. When China says that, we're a semi-sovereign, semi-colony that doesn't know its own mind, there's an element of truth in that. And that is, also borne out by how we behave in our own neighborhood. That we have, a country that others consider to be our equal power, and that's Pakistan. It's existed for 70 years. The way we deal with them is a signal to the rest of the world of how soft a state we are. The loss over that we've defeated them in 4 wars, but lost the narrative battle to them, both domestically and internationally. And we still let them define the image of our country abroad. That the Foreign Service of Pakistan does more to build the image of India abroad than the Indian Foreign Service does. Unfortunately, it's a very negative image. And we don't play the game. We don't even acknowledge that a game is being played. We're just like, oh, good intentions will shine in the end. And, kaam bolta hai, as a certain politician likes to say. It doesn't. No, you need to have a public diplomacy mentality. It's not enough to do good things like Vaccine Maitri. It's great that we sent vaccines to Barbados, but all of the media attention to that was in the domestic press. Not a single Western media outlet carried that news, because we thought, oh, it'll just shine through. No, you have to grab them by the balls and force them to. Either you pay them, or you induct your people, push them into the New York Times, like the ISI does, or put them into the Washington Post and make sure that they publish news that's favorable to you. That's the game. Learn to play it.
Indeed. So my conclusion is very simple. After listening everything and being mesmerized by it for long, I think we are nearing the 3-hour limit. So congratulations to everyone. But apart from the joke, I think we have had a very enlightened discussion tonight, and the purpose of the title is completed, because we discussed the intricacies of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, and we also discussed the problems with respect to what's happening anyways. Well, I hope that the Indian bureaucracy really adopts, and maybe if somebody's watching this, take the suggestion, or if not, it would matter, but still it depends. So the next episode of Indus Think will be coming on June 9th on a very interesting book. which is from the beginning of time. And as we were discussing a little bit about Brazil and also countries, we will have a discussion on the Brazilianization of the global order with Alex Hochuli very recently. We'll have it on maybe 13th of June on Global Hint, not Indus Think. But please do join these 2 episodes. These are very amazing discussions. And thank you so much for watching the episode 5 of Indus Think Season 1. And namaste from India. And never be the same. Know the world beyond.